book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Ezra Klein's new book, Why We're Polarized. This is from the introduction, and it's a couple pages into it. I'm starting out here. I have found that American politics is best understood by braiding two forms of knowledge that are often left separate: the direct on-the-ground insights shared by politicians, activists, government officials, and other subjects of my reporting, and the more systemic analyses conducted by political scientists, sociologists, historians, and others with the time, methods, and expertise to study American politics at scale. On their own, political actors often ignore the incentives shaping their decisions, and academic researchers miss the human motivations that drive political decision-making. Together, however, they shine bright light on how and why American politics works the way it does. There's much awry in American politics, and I won't in this book attempt to catalog all of it. But I've come to believe the master story, the one that drives almost all divides and most fundamentally shapes the behavior of participants, is the logic of polarization. That logic, put simply, is this: to appeal to a more polarized public, political institutions and political actors behave in more polarized ways. As political institutions and actors become more polarized, they further polarize the public. This sets off a feedback cycle. To appeal to a yet more polarized public, institutions must polarize further. When faced with yet more polarized institutions, the public polarizes further, and so on. Understanding that we exist in relationship with our political institutions, that they are changed by us and we are changed by them, is the key to this story. We don't just use politics for our own ends. Politics uses us for its own ends. There are many different types of polarization possible, and I'll discuss some of them later in the book, but the locus of polarization I'll discuss is on political identity. And that requires saying a few words about a term that should be very useful in American politics, but that has become almost useless: identity politics. A core argument of this book is that everyone engaged in American politics is engaged in identity politics. This is not an insult, and it's not controversial. We form and fold identities constantly, naturally. Identity is present in politics in the way gravity, evolution, or cognition is present in politics. That is to say, it is omnipresent in politics because it is omnipresent in us. There is no way to read the literature on how humans form and protect their personal and group identities, literature I will survey in this book, and believe that any of us is immune. It runs so deep in our psyches, so activated so easily by even weak cues and distant threats, that it is impossible to speak seriously about how we engage with one another without discussing how our identities shape that engagement. Unfortunately, the term identity politics has been weaponized. It is most often used by speakers to describe politics as practiced by members of historically marginalized groups. If you're black and you're worried about police brutality, that's identity politics. If you're a woman and you're worried about the male-female pay gap, that's identity politics. But if you're a rural gun owner decrying universal background checks as tyranny, or a billionaire CEO complaining that high tax rates demonize success, or a Christian insisting on nativity scenes in public squares, well, that's just good old-fashioned politics. With a quick sleight of hand, identity becomes something that only marginalized groups have. The term identity politics in this usage obscures rather than illuminates. It's used to diminish and discredit the concerns of weaker groups by making them look self-interested. Special pleading in order to clear the agenda for the concerns of stronger groups, which are framed as more rational, proper topics for normal political debate. But in wielding identity as a blade, we have lost it as a lens, blinding ourselves in a bid for political advantage. We're left searching in vain for what we refuse to allow ourselves to see. All politics is influenced by identity. Those identities are most powerful when they are so pervasive as to be either invisible or uncontroversial. American is an identity. So too is Christian. When politicians, including the irreligious, end speeches with "God bless America," it's not because they're making an appeal to a higher power, but because they're making an appeal to our bedrock identities. If you don't believe me, ask yourself why there are so few open atheists or even agnostics in national politics. This does not mean that politics is an equation solved by locating identity. Identity shapes our worldview, but it does not mechanistically decide it. And while we often speak of identity as a singular, It is always a dizzying plural. We have countless identities, some of them in active conflict with each other, others lying dormant until activated by threat or fortune. Much that happens in political campaigns is best understood as a struggle over which identities voters will inhabit come election day. Will they feel like workers exploited by their bosses, or heartlanders dismissed by coastal elites? Will they vote as patriotic traditionalists offended by NFL players who kneel during the national anthem, or as parents worried about the climate their children will inhabit? What we are often fighting over in American politics is group identity and status, fights that express themselves in debates over policy and power, but cannot be truly reconciled by either. Health policy is positive-sum, but identity conflict is zero-sum. The book, Why We're Polarized, by Ezra Klein.
So we've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program, and there's a really troubling concatenation of events, events, that are happening in the United States right now. We created these concentration camps for refugees seeking asylum. This was Stephen Miller's big project. And we've got concentration camps for children, concentration camps for male adults, concentration camps for female adults. And now we've got this virus sweeping through the United States, and people are starting to die in these concentration camps, which has provoked ICE or whoever's running them to deport hundreds of the children back to the countries that they came from without their parents, which is mind-boggling, and in many cases carrying disease. This is serious stuff, and we need to be talking about it. The new video is over at thomhartmann.com. To the Supreme Court pleadings, where it was really obvious that Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Alito, in particular, Thomas to some extent, were really trying to blow up the precedent of, the Paula Jones case, where the court said, yes, something the president did before he became president, there can be a subpoena in a civil case, and this was the case, and Congress can subpoena him. And the same thing in Nixon. But, these Republicans on the Supreme Court, they're like, oh, we don't want to go there. Oh, man. So here's the bottom line. And this is why I asked, are we now at the peak of Reaganism's stupidity? Reagan, in his first inaugural address, his first statement to the nation, said, government is not the solution to your problems. Government is the cause of your problems. And the Republicans took this to heart. I mean, this is why Trump's government, part of it is obviously Trump's just insane incompetence, but that even though the Obama administration left a handbook, an 87-page handbook, it's literally called the Handbook for Pandemic Response. They left a handbook on how to deal with the pandemic. They had a war game during the transition so that all of Trump's people could be involved in it and understand what's going on about how to respond to a coronavirus. And Donald Trump last night was rage tweeting, calling all that stuff Obamagate. Honest to God. Obama left us a handbook. Obama, and Mitch McConnell goes on a radio station this morning and goes, well, the Obama administration didn't leave us anything, and therefore we had a stupid, incoherent response because we only had 3 years to get ready for this. And they're really trying to make Obamagate trend on Twitter. The bottom line is Trump didn't plan for the pandemic because Republicans don't believe the government can do anything right. So why should government plan to do something? Trump's government didn't plan for testing because Republicans believe government can't solve problems. You know, a half dozen cases of coronavirus in Wuhan, China this week have led the Chinese government to this week, over the next 7 days, they're going to test 11 million people. They are going to find the virus. They are going to find the people who are still infected. They are going to quarantine them, and they are going to stop this virus dead in its tracks. But we can't test an entire American city, even a little town where there might be a meatpacking plant and 15,000 people, and we can't even test that because Republicans know that government can't solve problems. Government is the problem. Didn't you know? I mean, St. Reagan told us this on January 20th, 1981, and it has been the absolute marching orders of Republicans ever since. Government can't solve problems. Government is the problem. I suppose if you're Charles Koch, government is the problem. Government is constantly saying, no, you can't exploit your workers. You can't poison the air. You can't poison the water. I understand it's more profitable. Koch Industries, ExxonMobil, fill in the blank, Dow Chemical. I understand it's more profitable. You can't do it. Oh, well, government is the problem, obviously. We have healthcare workers and hospital workers dying and spreading this infection among their families because hospitals are overwhelmed and don't have personal protective equipment. Why? Because Trump's government never planned to help them out because Republicans know that Americans and American government can't solve problems. You've got to wait for the billionaires to solve problems. They're the only ones who can solve problems. While the unemployment rates in Northern Europe have not gone above 6%, the unemployment rate in Denmark is 5% right now. Because their governments are providing direct relief both to the employers and to the people. Australia is giving every single person in Australia, every single worker in Australia, $3,000 a month, period. Here you go. They're not experiencing an explosion in unemployment in Australia. But we are looking at Great Depression levels of unemployment, over 20%, perhaps even over 30%. The peak of the Great Depression was 25%. We are looking at these levels of unemployment that are going to devastate the lives of an entire generation of Americans. Because Donald Trump and Republicans know that government can't solve problems. Government is the problem, don't you know? Governments prevent billionaires from ripping people off. They prevent banks from ripping you off. They prevent, oil companies from polluting the world. They prevent chemical companies from poisoning us. Governments are a problem if you're a billionaire or a business person or a big corporation. And that's who Ronald Reagan was speaking on behalf of. That's who George W. Bush was speaking on behalf of. That's who Donald Trump is speaking on behalf of right now. We have an international program. They met last week. An international coalition of countries who are bringing their top scientists and their top businesses in the healthcare field, in the vaccine, to develop a vaccine, to jointly develop a vaccine. The only developed country in the world that chose not to participate was the United States. Why? Because Trump knows the government can't do things right. St. Ronnie was right. It's got to be. We are 4.5% of the world's population. We have a third of the world's coronavirus cases and about a third of the world's deaths. A little less than that. We'll get there. Why? Well, apparently St. Reagan was right. America can't solve problems. American government doesn't work. At least when Republicans are in charge. We need the leadership of good government. And if Donald Trump and the Republican Party can't govern, and they have proven that they can't govern, all they can do is lie and cheat and steal and then try to prevent people from voting. That's their thing, right? This is their thing. This is their new strategy. I mean, new as of 1981. Really as of 2000 in a big way. And so in the Supreme Court today, Donald Trump's lawyers go in and say, they didn't use this argument explicitly in the Supreme Court. They did in the lower court before the Supreme Court. That is the case that the Supreme Court is ruling on. That if Donald Trump walked out in front of Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue and started shooting people, that the police could not even stop him from killing more people because he's the president and he's immune. And you've got, at least from what I heard this morning, 4 Republican justices on the court, Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, who think that that's God's gospel. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, Australia and New Zealand are putting together what they're calling a travel bubble. I got to tell you about this after the break. This is what happens in those countries where they never bought into the idea that government can't work or can't help, and that only billionaires should be making choices and running things and deciding. Australia and New Zealand are up to something really extraordinary. 4 minutes, I'll give you the whole story. Stick around. Oh, hang on just a minute.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
By the way, in our second hour, Dr. Michael Mann, the climate scientist, is going to be here about a whole pile of stuff. And Lori Wallach in our third hour about our drug supply. And welcome back. Anthony in Philadelphia. Hey, Anthony, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Good to be on. About maybe a week or so ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, I called in when you had a representative from Wisconsin on the program. And I asked
Congressman Pocan.
Yes, and I asked him about if he supported the employees having 50% control of the board. And he said, of course, he had spoken to other members of Congress about it, and there was some interest. But I wanted to get your take, especially considering that right now you're discussing, the Republicans putting out that narrative that government is incompetent. So instead of the left saying, yes, government is incompetent, we evolved the discussion to the corporate board and pose the question is, how about we give all of the people in our democracy more say in the corporate world so that we're not dependent upon unions and the government to respond to these decisions that the corporations make?
Right. A little history here for you, Anthony.
Okay.
In 1945, 46, I forget exactly when it was, but there were a series of meetings between the Truman administration and the German government as we were beginning the administration of the Marshall Act, as we were giving money and loaning money to Germany to rebuild their own industrial economic base. And yes. Truman essentially said to them, you guys were the first country in the world to have a national health care system. It was put into place in the 1880s by the Bismarck as a way to basically pacify the people. It was frankly in response to an explosion of Marxism. Karl Marx had been, his book Das Kapital had come out in the 1860s, and he was German, and it was published in German. It was a big hit in Germany. And so the Kaiser thought, well, we'll hold off this whole socialism thing by giving everybody health care. So anyhow, Harry Truman basically said to the Germans, that was a good idea. You need to put that in your constitution, because Germany was rewriting their constitution. He also said, we tried here in the United States. Now, keep in mind, this was, I believe this was just before the Republicans passed Taft-Hartley in 1947 in the House and Senate, which gave states the ability to destroy unions if they chose to. And, so Harry Truman is saying to the Germans, we had a very good experience with unionization here in the United States, and we're hoping for a better experience, but the Republicans are trying to destroy that. Why don't you put that in your Constitution? And so the Germans did a two-step. They literally, first with health care, they wrote into their Constitution that health care is a human right that cannot be denied, number one. And number two, so government has to provide if nobody else can. And number two, they said unionization is a right under this Constitution. And number three, they extended that to say that any corporation that has more than 1,000 employees must have 50% of its board of directors made up of representatives of organized labor who are the workers in the company, not management. And Germany put that into law. I don't know of any other developed country that has gone quite that far, but it's worked really well for Germany all these years. And German corporations are extraordinarily responsive and responsible to their people. So, yeah, we should be doing the same thing here. It was our idea, Anthony. This was Harry Truman's idea.
Wow.
So, it's an amazing story. Anthony, thanks a lot for the call. Thanks for bringing it all up. It's good stuff. I mean, this is really good stuff. And it's good, and it's particularly good for us to know our history. Yeah, it's just the stuff, and from Truman's point of view, he was like, let's do proof of concept, right? Because Harry Truman was the first American president to call for a national single-payer healthcare system, too. We'll be right back. Our 1 hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3 hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. So we've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program, and there's a really troubling concatenation of events that are happening in the United States right now. We created these concentration camps for refugees seeking asylum. This was Stephen Miller's big project. And we've got concentration camps for children, concentration camps for male adults, concentration camps for female adults. And now we've got this virus sweeping through the United States, and people are starting to die in these concentration camps, which has provoked ICE or whoever's running them to deport hundreds of the children back to the countries that they came from without their parents, which is mind-boggling, and in many cases carrying disease. This is serious stuff, and we need to be talking about it. The new video is over at thomhartmann.com. So, just to very quickly restate what I was mentioning as I'm on the way out. In the second hour of our program, Dr. Michael Mann is going to drop by. I've got a bunch of questions for him. Has the economic shutdown all around the world, which has caused our air to be clear, our skies to be free of jet trails, contrails, and all that kind of stuff, has that taken us to the point that the IPCC said we needed to be to at this point? Remember, they said about 3 years ago, they said you got 10 years to get your act under control or all is lost. Did this do it, or do we need to go even farther? Number one. Number two, what about these large chunks of the world? We're now hearing warnings from scientists that much of equatorial planet Earth, the equator, the area around the equator, within a few years will become uninhabitable. It's going to become like the Sahara Desert. Is that true? And what's happening with sea level rise? And what's going on in the Amazon? Those are my questions for Dr. Michael Mann, who will be with us in our second hour. In our third hour, Lori Wallach, who is the executive director of Public Citizen's Global Trade Watch. Public Citizen, of course, the extraordinary organization that Ralph Nader started back in the 70s. She is the world's trade expert. And I want to ask her, what's going on with our drugs, our drug supply? I am hearing from pharmacies that our entire drug supply is hugely at risk because 90 to 95% of all our drugs are manufactured in China or India. And, I want to know what the story is with that. But here in this first hour, I was asking, is it time to stop letting Republicans run government? Because obviously they don't believe in government. Why are we letting them run government? Why do we elect these people who don't believe in government to run the government? It's like hiring a chiropractor who doesn't believe in pharmaceuticals, and there are some. There's a lot of chiropractors who are great. I've used chiropractors since I was, since I broke my back when I was 19 or 20 years old. But I've run across a few who are like, oh, you shouldn't take drugs, just take vitamin C. It's like hiring one of those people to be in charge of your cancer treatment or your brain surgery. It's like hiring somebody who thinks the Earth is flat to design the space program. It's like I mean, come up with your metaphor. I didn't mean to pick on chiropractors. Sorry about that, guys. But you get what I'm saying. Why? Tell me, why? Are we hiring people? Why are we voting for people for our city council, for our county commissioners, for our local sheriffs, for our state legislatures, for our governorships, for our senators, for our members of the House, for president? Why are we hiring people who don't believe in government to run the government? I mean, isn't it obvious now what happens? 40 years of Reaganism, 40 years of hate government Republicans. We have gutted the middle class. We're in the midst of what's going to be the second Republican Great Depression in 100 years. We've got people dying. We have lost more people in 3 months than we lost in the entire Vietnam War, than the entire Korean War. We've lost 3 times as many people as we lost in the entire Revolutionary War. It's insane. So anyhow, I was telling you about Australia and New Zealand. In Australia, from the beginning, from back in January when the first deaths started happening, Australia has had 97 people die. The whole country. Here in Oregon, we've had, I think it's 120 some odd die. The entire country, and we're doing really good. We had like 50, 60 new cases yesterday, statewide. Governor Kate Brown has crushed this virus so far, knock on wood. I feel safe here. Well, it's even better in Australia. The whole damn country, 97 deaths over 3 months. They have broken the back of the virus. In New Zealand, they've only had 21 deaths. The whole country. Their hospitals are not overwhelmed. Their people are not freaked out. They're reopening their economies. People are going back to the beaches and the stores. And Australia and New Zealand are talking about creating basically a giant free trade zone between the two of them, where their people can travel back and forth and their goods can travel back and forth. The major source of tourism to New Zealand is actually Australians. So, hey, let's open it back up. They also want to extend this to some of the Pacific Island nations that have no cases. There are some island nations that have no cases, and there's quite a few where they've done the same thing. They've broken the back of this, and it might eventually extend to Taiwan and South Korea. We need leadership of government that believes in and knows how to run good government. But instead, what do we have? What we have here is the Trump administration, where Donald Trump goes on TV and says, oh yeah, this drug I heard about on Fox News, this is wonderful. It's going to be very exciting. I think it could be a game changer. It could be a game changer. Very powerful. They're very powerful. End quote. So the Veterans Administration tried this out on a couple hundred veterans. The people who received the standard course of treatment, 11.4% of them died. The people who received the hydrochloroquine, 27.8% died. Then the Veterans Administration did another study. Again, the hydrochloroquine, 19%. I'll tell you about this after the break. I'll get you. And
you're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Bottom line, they killed a bunch of veterans to find out if Donald Trump's cockamamie idea, the Fox News idea, worked, and it didn't work.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Defying Hitler by Sebastian Haffner, a memoir. This is from chapter 17, about a little more than a third of the way into the book. At first, the revolution only gave the impression of being an historical event like any other, a matter for the press that might just possibly have some effect on the public mood. The Nazis celebrate January 30th as their day of revolution. They are wrong. There was no revolution on January 30th, 1933, just a change of government. Hitler became chancellor, by no means the Führer of the Nazi regime. The cabinet contained only 2 Nazis apart from him. He swore an oath of allegiance to the Weimar Constitution. The general opinion was that it was not the Nazis who had won, but the bourgeois parties of the right, who had captured, in quotes, the Nazis and held all the key positions in the government. In constitutional terms, events had taken a much more conventional, unrevolutionary course than most of what had happened during the previous 6 months. Outwardly also, the day had no revolutionary aspects, unless one considers a Nazi torchlight procession through Wilhelmstrasse or a minor gunfight in the suburbs that night as signs of a revolution. For most of us outsiders, the experience of January 30th, 1933 was that of reading the papers and the emotions we felt while we were doing so. The morning headline was, "Hitler called to president." That produced a certain nervous, impotent irritation. Hitler had been called to the president in August and November. He had been offered the vice-chancellorship and then the chancellorship. Both times he had set impossible conditions, and both times there had been solemn declarations, "Never again." Each time, "never again" had lasted exactly 3 months. Hitler's opponents in Germany at that time suffered from a compulsive urge to offer him everything he wanted, indefatigably, and at an even cheaper price, indeed to press it upon him. It's the same now with his opponents outside Germany. Again and again, this appeasement was formally renounced, and again it gaily reappeared at the crucial moment. Just so today. Then, as now, one's only hope was Hitler's own unreasonableness. Would it not sooner or later exhaust the patience of his opponents? Then, as now, it became apparent that their patience knew no bounds. At midday, the headline said, "Hitler makes impossible demands." We nodded, half reassured. It was only too credible. It would have gone against his nature to ask for less than too much. Perhaps the cup had once more passed from us. Hitler, the last defense against Hitler. At about 5 o'clock, the evening papers arrived. Cabinet of National Unity formed Hitler Reichschancellor. I don't know what the general reaction was. For about a minute, mine was completely correct. Icy horror. Certainly this had been a possibility for a long time. You had to reckon with it. Nevertheless, it was so bizarre, so incredible to read it now in black and white. Hitler, Reichschancellor. For a moment, I physically sensed the man's odor of blood and filth, the nauseating approach of a man-eating animal, its foul, sharp claws in my face. Then I shook the sensation off, tried to smile, started to consider, and found many reasons for reassurance. That evening, I discussed the prospects of the new government with my father. We agreed it had a good chance of doing a lot of damage, but not much chance of surviving very long. A deeply reactionary government with Hitler as its mouthpiece. Apart from this, it did not really differ much from the two governments that had succeeded Brüning's. Even with the Nazis, it would not have a majority in the Reichstag. Of course, that could always be dissolved, but the government had a clear majority of the population against it, in particular the working class, which would probably go communist now that the Social Democrats had completely discredited themselves. One could prohibit the communists, but that would only make them more dangerous. In the meantime, the government would be likely to implement reactionary social and cultural measures with some anti-Semitic additions to please Hitler. That would not attract any of its opponents to its side. Foreign policy would probably be a matter of banging the table. There might be an attempt to rearm. That would automatically add the outside world to the 60% of the home population who were against the Hitler government. Besides, who were the people who had suddenly started voting Nazi in the last 3 years? Misguided ignoramuses, for the most part, victims of propaganda, a fluctuating mass that would fall apart at the first disappointment. No, all things considered, this government was not a cause for alarm. The only question was what would come after it. It was possible that they would drive the country to civil war. The communists were capable of going on the attack before a prohibition against them came into force. The next day, this turned out to be the general opinion of the intelligent press. It is curious how plausible an argument it is, even today, when we know what came next. How could things turn out so completely different? Perhaps it was just because we were all so certain that they could not do so, and relied on that with far too much confidence. So we neglected to consider that it might, if worse came to worse, be necessary to prevent the disaster from happening. Through the whole of February 1933, everything that happened remained a matter for the press. In other words, it took place in an arena that would lose all reality for 99% of the population. For 99% of the population, the moment there were no newspapers. Admittedly, enough occurred in that arena. The Reichstag was dissolved. Then, in a flagrant breach of the Constitution, Hindenburg also dissolved the Prussian regional parliament. There were fast and furious changes of personnel in the civil service. The book Define Hitler.
Coming up on the Science Revolution this week, entomologist Professor Gard W. Otis is here on the murder hornets. They invade hives and decapitate the bees inside in just a matter of hours, and scientists worry about them gaining a foothold in North America. Beyond nuclears, Kevin Camps drops by on the announcement of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission that it's proceeding illegally with licensing a proposed high-level radioactive waste dump in New Mexico. Plus, author Stephen Hassan on the cult of Trump. Find the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Michael in Bronx, New York. Hey, Michael, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Great to talk with you. I had to call you in regards to the Supreme Court hearing that's going on. And
yes,
for one thing, I can make a connection with, you recall back when Trump had said to a bunch of police officers in Nassau County, which was seen nationwide, telling cops not to be so cordial with the people you come across, go ahead and bang their heads on the car hoods, rough them up and show them who's boss. And I heard one other person rightfully refer to that as using cops as props. But then, he's setting a precedent that law enforcement is absolute, no questions asked. But then you look back at a couple of weeks ago when he says, liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia, and you see his base acting the fool, going into storming these state capitol buildings armed with guns and very hostile, considerably violent manner, confronting law enforcement, and he praises them for doing that. So you got two sides of this going on right now, and with this Supreme Court supposedly to decide if Trump is above the law, number one, we all know that he's not and is supposed to stay that way. But I want everyone to consider that people who are rooting for Trump, if the Supreme Court lets him get away with all of this and say that he is above the law, I'm sorry, I cannot put it past the other things that he said in terms of violating women and violating others. Supreme Court better consider they have families also, and you may be just giving him the green light to violate them and violate others like you and me, God forbid. That's how scary this is.
Yeah, it was bizarre hearing those arguments this morning. Brett Kavanaugh kept trying to distract and deflect. They were talking about records in civil cases, and Kavanaugh says, well, what about medical records? And they're like, we're not talking about medical records. Well, couldn't he subpoena, couldn't they subpoena the medical records of the president's kids and grandkids? No, we're not talking about that, Kavanaugh. I mean, it was bizarre. It was absolutely bizarre. And keep in mind, these are the same lawyers, and Michael, your point is well taken. These are the same lawyers who argued that they literally argued this in a lower court, that if Donald Trump walked out onto Fifth Avenue with a gun and started shooting people, not only could he not be investigated, not only could he not be prosecuted, he could not even be arrested, he could not even be stopped. You just have to let him keep shooting until the bullet was out of guns. And if he got another gun, you just have to stand there and watch. That was the argument that they made that is now before the Supreme Court. That Donald Trump is fully and truly above the law. Which is, as Michael points out, it's kind of bizarre, if not ironic. On the one hand, he's saying, government can't do anything, government should have no authority. I am the supreme head of government. I have all the authority. I can do whatever I want, and no one can stop me. It's like heads meet tails. I mean, it's bizarre. Dennis in Bergenfield, New Jersey. Hey, Dennis, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, I'd like to talk about billionaires. So in one day, 8 people made $6.2 billion while 33 million Americans lost their jobs. My question is, how would you respond to people who say that billionaires earn their money? How would you, fair and square, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, may well be. I kind of like the old saying, behind every great fortune, there's a great crime, but it's not always true. And, a lot of billionaires came up with cool ideas or, whatever. I mean, inherited some good money from daddy, whatever the case may be. But I think the larger question, Dennis, is not whether people earn their money or not, but how much is enough? How much is too much, in fact? At what point does private accumulation of wealth begin to damage society? At what point does it begin to damage the ability of government to function? And frankly, I think, $1 billion is an absolute upper limit, an absolute upper limit. And I would argue that we should have an income tax that, when you're making, like it was when Ronald Reagan came into office, like it was during Nixon's time, and during Lyndon Johnson's time, and Jimmy Carter's time, and Dwight Eisenhower's time, and Jack Kennedy's time, and Harry Truman's time, that when you started earning over about $3 million a year in today's money, your top tax rate went up to around 90%. And of course, LBJ dropped that down to 74% in 67. But still, your top tax rate went up to 74% when you started earning over $3 million a year. And so as a result of that, prior to Reagan, your average CEO made 30 times what the janitor made, the lowest paid employee, 30 times. Now, in some cases, it's 10,000 times, 100,000 times. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And what we know now, particularly if you look at the work by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, their book, The Spirit Level, their book, Why Inequality Matters, is that when these huge concentrations of wealth happen, it distorts democracy. Because wealth is power, it's political power. The Supreme Court has made it so. And it distorts society as a whole. The greater the inequality in a society, the higher the levels of teenage pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, suicide, mental illness, homicide, drug addiction, illiteracy. I mean, you name the social ill, homelessness, you name your social ill, it goes up when societies become more unequal. I'm not talking about societies becoming poorer, just more unequal. So, yeah, I have a problem with that. And I think that, we have historically had this problem. Teddy Roosevelt saw this in 1907 and said, okay, enough. We're going to do something about this. And they passed the inheritance tax. And, which the Walton family hired Frank Luntz and said, change the word from inheritance tax. Everybody kind of likes that, or estate tax. And he turned it into the death tax, right, with Walton money. And step by step. Anyhow, Dan in Olympia, Washington. Hey, Dan, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Glad to be on the show. I totally agree with what your assessment of our current taxation situation. And I think what people don't really realize is that all these guys that are sitting on their fannies on Wall Street making all this dough, people don't realize that back in the 50s, in order for those rich people to get rich, they had to produce more. In other words, when they have to pay higher taxes in order to maintain their profit margins, they have to do more to make that money. These days, they really don't have to do anything. They can sit on their butts and depend on Wall Street. The reason I'm calling
now, all they have to do is to direct their chief financial officer to take a couple $1 billion of their profit and buy back their stock in the open market. It drives up the stock price, which is how they're compensated, and they get it. They drop an extra 10, 20, 30, 50, $100 million in their check account.
Exactly, and we've seen it happen time and time again. The point I want to make is, while we want to point our fingers at all these different, politicians, and I'll be the first to admit that our current president's reprehensible behavior knows no depths, but we elected him. And when I look at all of the different things going on around the country, I have to say to myself, we keep electing the same people who continue to keep screwing us. It's our citizenry that's not paying attention. We
did not elect Donald Trump, Dan. The Electoral College elected Donald Trump. We voted for Hillary Clinton to the tune of 3 million more votes than Donald Trump got. But your point is well taken, and it's a testimonial to the effectiveness of this giant right-wing media machine, this giant right-wing lie machine that was built based on the Powell Memo in 1971, that was built throughout the 1970s and 1980s, that then brought us the Reagan administration, brought us right-wing hate radio, brought us the Murdoch family's, Fox News that's literally killing Americans, with their denial and whatnot. This is just to address what you're talking about. This from Bloomberg News. Canada unveiled, this is just 2 days ago, Canada unveiled a loan program for large firms. Right up to this point, Canada has been bailing out average working people, and they've been bailing out small businesses. But the big businesses in Canada were saying, wait a minute, we need some help. And so, in the United States, we helped the big companies first, and now we're talking about helping the small companies, maybe if Mitch McConnell will allow it. In Canada, they helped out the small companies and the citizens first. But then, the big companies came along and said, we need some money too. And so Canada appropriated, they created this thing called the Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility. They endowed it with $214 million, which is big bucks in Canada. And just listen to this. This is Kate Bolsonaro wrote this for Bloomberg. Firms in all sectors can apply for the funding except the finance industry. Banks can't get the money. Companies that do receive the money will have to accept limits on executive pay, dividends, and share buybacks. No banks, no insurance companies, no brokerage houses. You can't have any money, sorry. And by the way, anybody else who gets it, you got to cut the pay of your CEO or at least freeze it. No more bonuses, no more stock buybacks.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
The difference between us and Canada? Canada never had a Supreme Court that said that corporations are people and that owning politicians was free speech. That's the big difference. And welcome back. Richard in Tacoma, Washington. Hey, Richard, what's on your mind?
Oh, Tom, please review the insidious influence of the history of the Ayn Rand philosophy on our current situation. I know that you know it deeply and well. The Ayn Rand philosophy was favored by Paul Ryan, Alan Greenspan. Your comments apropos to your current commentary.
Yeah.
It has influenced our government.
Yes, I agree, Richard. And, Paul Ryan required people to, when they joined his team when he was in the House of Representatives and when he was Speaker of the House, required people to read Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged. Phil Proctor, the guy from the Firesign Theater, an old friend of mine, forwarded me a cartoon 2 or 3 days ago. I think it was Saturday he forwarded it to me. And it was a picture of, a dad and his son. They were sitting on the son's bed in his bedroom. And the dad was holding something that looked like a book or a magazine in his hand. And the son had this kind of worried look on his face. And the caption was the dad saying to the son, I don't so much care about the porno magazines and the cigarettes, but I want to know who gave you this Ayn Rand book.
There you go.
It was like,
and Elon Musk today is practicing.
Another acolyte of Ayn Rand.
He's practicing the Ayn Rand philosophy right today.
Sure. Yeah. You're absolutely right. And Trump is cheering him on, by the way.
And it was mentioned that Donald Trump favors that book among the few he ever reads.
Yeah, although I don't believe he ever read it. I think he used to have Hitler's collected speeches next to his bed, according to his first wife. And those were, short excerpts. So I'm guessing that's probably the only thing he's ever read. Richard, thank you for the call. Spot on. George in Palm Desert, California. Hey, George, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, hi. Quick question, Tom. I often hear Agent Orange in the White House say that he inherited empty shells from Obama, and I'm not quite sure what he's referring to. Is he referring to PPE or what? If you could clarify that.
He's just pulling stuff out of his backside, George. He's just lying through his teeth. He didn't inherit any empty shells from Obama.
That's what I figured.
The national stockpile was there. One of the things he did do about a year before we needed that stockpile is he cut the budget for maintenance. So many of those machines, when they went to take them out of stockpile, because they hadn't been maintained in over a year, the plastic was starting to dry out and crack and had to be, hoses had to be replaced. Batteries had died to the point where, they had to be replaced. I mean, they require regular, at the very least, annual maintenance, and Trump had stopped that. But he had a stockpile. One of his other complaints is that Obama left him broken and I forget the word, dysfunctional or something like that, coronavirus tests. Well, there was no coronavirus. It's called COVID-19 because it was discovered in 2019. Trump became president in 2017. So, he's just lying through his teeth, George. This is what he does.
That's what I figured. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, thanks a lot, George. And in fact, there was a fascinating study that one of the psychologists out there published over the weekend showing that when Trump lies, he actually speeds up his rate of speech. He talks a little faster, which means he's more comfortable. He's actually more comfortable when he's making crap up than when he's telling the truth. We'll be back. Did you know that Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president in 1980 and George Herbert Walker Bush was in on it and he avoided being prosecuted for this in 1992 with a little help from Bill Barr? It's on page 116 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Richard in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Hey, Richard, what's up?
Hi. Thanks for taking my call. Regarding this accumulation of obscene wealth, I actually think it belongs in the DSM.
It is in the DSM.
To actually acquire, hoarding, but not really the accumulation of wealth. That's given a pass.
How is having a house filled floor to ceiling with newspapers any different than having a house filled floor to ceiling with gold and statues and
or with $1,000 bills? I agree with you, right, but I think it actually should be identified. And furthermore, it actually hurts the society in which you live. That's right. There's a sickness here. So I think it actually needs to be categorized and identified. So.
I absolutely agree with you, Richard. I absolutely agree, and to your point against my point or whatever you want to call it, I agree with you that the hoarding syndrome, which is in the DSM, it needs to be defined to extend to money, or there needs to be a separate category about hoarding excessive wealth and being willing to destroy other people's lives to get it, which is another piece of that. Spot on, Richard. Brilliant. Thank you, Barry in River Forest, Illinois. Hey, Barry, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Hey, listen, I'm a speed reader, and I wanted to recommend some books to you. If you had the chance to read Crash by Adam Tooze. Have you heard of it?
I have not. No.
And The Wizard and the Prophet by Charles C. Mann. They talk about the mid-20th century, about the superseed and how the United States was trying to overcome stem rust with the Farm Belt. And that once we were able to create a superseed in the way of crops.
I am not familiar with these, Barry, but thanks for the suggestion. And generally speaking, if you have suggestions for books for me to read or movies to see or whatever, just tell our call screener, because that's whatever. Alfredo in Mountain View, California. Hey, Alfredo, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Hi. Yeah, I like your comments you were making earlier about why people keep voting for Republicans and they don't want to govern. And, if Republicans, I don't think they're actually being elected. They're rigging the system, with gerrymandering, rigging the computer voting machines, purging voters, millions of voters out of voting. So, that was my my answer to that.
You're right. You're right. In Wisconsin, for example, more people voted for Democrats for the state legislature, yet it's controlled by Republicans. More people voted for for members of Congress for Democrats than for Republicans, and yet their legislative balances out of the same thing in North Carolina. I mean, this is happening all over the country, where you end up with these Republican legislatures, Republican-controlled legislatures, or a Republican congressional delegation because of gerrymandering. This is, all the games that they played with redrawing districts back after the 2010 election in 2011, 2012. Charles in Miami. Hey, Charles, what's up?
Hey, I'm always loving your show, Tom, but I got to disagree with you when you say, well, I put it this way. When Republican and conservative, when they take over, when it's their governments, that's when we fail. That's when Americans die. So they don't know how to govern and they don't know how to rule. To be honest with you, the only way I feel about it is they don't care if people live. They don't care how you live, as long as they get rich, whether it's from government contracts, and no bid contracts, because you've always talked about this American oligarchy, and I would say that the government contracts, the no bids, even what is this? Well, they bring along, they turn those people into oligarchs. The privatization. That's what I'm trying to say.
So what are we disagreeing about, Charles? Because it sounds to me like you're saying what I've been saying.
Well, I mean, you say I just term it in this way: when Republican government governing, that's the problem. They don't know how to govern, but you gotta put it in the right word. You got to put Republican in front, because government is not the problem. It's the way Republicans run it. And of course, they want to.
I would argue with you, Charles. Though you say they don't know how to run government, I think that they do know how to run government. They just choose not to, because a well-run government would regulate and control corporate and billionaire behavior to bend it toward the good of society, and they would rather not control corporate and billionaire behavior, because the corporations and the billionaires are the ones who pay their checks. They're the ones who give them cushy jobs when they get out of Congress. They're the ones who pay for their campaigns. I mean, you gotta keep paying the piper here.
Right. You mean like Mitch McConnell right now saying that he doesn't want another stimulus bill, because this other stimulus bill would probably have, corporations and rich people paying more in taxes. And that's the reason why I think he doesn't.
Well, it's not just that. It's mostly focused on the bottom half of America. The bill, this new, they're going to call it CARES 2. The Democrats are going to announce either late today or tomorrow what's in it. But the early information that we have is it's going to be larger than the $2.2 trillion of the original CARES bill. And most of the money is going to go to individual people like you and me, Charles, and to small businesses. And that is intolerable to Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell is a multimillionaire himself. He's married to a multi-hundred millionaire, a Taiwanese shipping family, Elaine Chao's family. He is subsidized and sponsored and funded by millionaires and billionaires in the United States. He doesn't give a rat's ass about poor people in Kentucky or anywhere else in the United States. Never has his whole entire life. And particularly people of color. He disdains people of color. So you look at Mitch McConnell and it's the personification. He is the perfect face of the Republican Party, with all this bizarre stuff. Charles, I got to run, but thank you for the call. You said it well, and I disagree. We don't disagree. How's that? It's like the argument booth in the old Monty Python routine, I'm here for an argument. No, you're not. Yes, I am. We'll be back. We're going to check in with Dr. Michael Mann, one of the world's top climate scientists.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Here's how I feel about
We say fight back!
Today's book in our book club is The Hidden History of the War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back, by this guy, Thom Hartmann. This is from chapter 1, or from the introduction, actually. In 2016, 6% of Americans who were eligible to vote nominated Donald Trump as the GOP's presidential candidate. It was 8% for Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. Trump went on to be elected president by 26% of eligible voters. The modern American oligarchs have largely stayed in power using 3 simple elements: explicit and overt racism, massive disinformation campaigns, and voter suppression. No ideas, no push for better schools, hospitals, airports, roads, or bridges, or reform of our health, energy, or financial systems. No promise of more and better jobs. None of these staples of past presidential campaigns can be found in pretty much any Republican advertising today. Instead, the public Republican message is all about race, or the subset of race, religion. Muslim stands in for brown Arab in GOP speak, and immigration, aka brown people from south of our border, and socialism. Meanwhile, Republican secretaries of state across the nation are vigorously purging voters from the rolls. Over 17 million, more than 10% of America's active voters, in just the 2016-2018 period, according to NBC News. After the 5 Republican appointees on the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, 14 GOP-controlled states moved within a year, some within days, to restrict access to the vote, particularly for communities of color, students, and retired people. In North Carolina, for example, 158 polling places were permanently closed in the 40 counties with the most African-American voters just before the 2016 election, leading to a 16% decline in African-American early voting in that state. An MIT study found that nationwide, Hispanic voters wait 150% longer in line than white voters, and black voters can expect to wait 200% longer in line to vote. In Indiana, then Governor Mike Pence's new rigorous voter ID law caused an 11.5% drop in African-American voting. Students are suing for their right to vote, and retired people who no longer drive but care passionately about their Social Security and Medicare are being turned away at the polls by the hundreds of thousands because their driver's licenses have expired. The obvious failure of 40-plus years of Reaganomics and GOP policies to maintain a functional middle class in America has been a problem for the modern GOP. In 1974, for example, the GOP had outright control of only 7 states. The message, elect us and we'll help the rich people, just didn't generally resonate with American voters. It's the reason why, outside of the fluke elections of 46 and 52, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives outright for 3 generations, from 1933 to 1996, and controlled the Senate for most of that time. Desperate to win the presidency for the GOP in 1968, Richard Nixon went so far as to commit treason by torpedoing a peace deal with President Lyndon Johnson that President Lyndon Johnson had worked out with the North and South Vietnamese. According to Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, then president of Iran, Ronald Reagan did the same thing by cutting a deal with Iran whereby they would hold on to the U.S. embassy hostages until after the 1980 presidential election, torpedoing Jimmy Carter's chances of re-election. But in 2000, the GOP changed tactics. After Reagan was almost busted for his part in Iran-Contra, he testified that he had forgotten about details of the program more than 80 times. His growing Alzheimer's spared him an indictment. They realized that getting busted for treason wasn't worth the risk. They needed a plan B, and it was deliciously simple. If most voters don't like what you're selling, then just don't let them vote. Paul Weyrich promoted this idea back in 1980 when he was campaigning for Reagan after co-founding the Heritage Foundation. And indeed, many Republican luminaries, such as William Rehnquist, who went from serving the GOP by standing in polling places and intimidating Hispanic and Native American voters in the 1960s, to becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, rose up through the ranks by participating in Republican-run voter intimidation schemes. Voter suppression became the foundational go-to tactic for the GOP in 2000. Although the GOP attacked Democratic presidential nominee Al Gore with smear and innuendo, ridiculing him for helping write the legislation that created the modern internet, for example, the main thing that got George W. Bush into the White House was voter suppression. His brother, Florida Governor Jeb Bush, and Bush's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, threw somewhere between 20,000 and 90,000 African-American voters off the rolls. They were able to get the vote close enough. The 5 Republican appointees to the Supreme Court functionally awarded Bush the presidency. The BBC covered this in 2001 in 2 major investigative reports that were seen all over the world, except on any American media. By 2016, the Republican Party had fine-tuned its voter suppression and intimidation systems to the point that they ran like well-oiled machines in nearly 30 states. Between the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections, for example, Ohio had purged more than 2 million voters from its rolls, the vast majority, more than 2-to-1, in heavily African-American and Hispanic counties. The 5 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court ruled in 2017 that they could keep it up. And other states have since adopted their new tactic of caging voters. The book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting, by me.
So we've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program, and it's there's a really troubling concatenation of events events that are happening in the United States right now. We created these concentration camps for refugees seeking asylum. This was Stephen Miller's big project. And we've got concentration camps for children, concentration camps for male adults, concentration camps for female adults. And now we've got this virus sweeping through the United States, and people are starting to die in these concentration camps, which has provoked ICE or whoever's running them to deport hundreds of the children back to the countries that they came from without their parents, which is mind-boggling, and in many cases carrying disease. This is serious stuff, and we need to be talking about it. The new video is over at thomhartmann.com.
People within the agency who for some reason were unwilling to accept me as part of their team. Unwanted Spy by Jeffrey Sterling.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So I noticed in this, or I mentioned in the setup as I was just leaving the previous hour, that in the next hour, one of the finest scientists in the world, one of the top scientists, would be with us. And his credentials are constantly right. Michael Mann, in addition to writing dire predictions, understanding climate change, the hockey stick in the climate wars, dispatches from the front lines. He basically invented the hockey stick that Al Gore popularized. His book, The Madhouse Effect, with Tom Tolles. His children's book, The Tantrum That Saved the World. Now, this press release from Penn State University. Dr. Michael Mann, Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Sciences and Director of Penn State's Earth Systems Science Center at Penn State, has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, recognizing distinguished and continuing achievements in original research. Membership in the NAS is one of the highest honors given to any scientist or engineer in the United States. By the way, the National Academy of Sciences was established in 1863, signed into law by President Lincoln, specifically to recognize achievement in science, and then basically to ask those people who are members of the Academy to be advisors in the areas of science, engineering, health policy, et cetera, science basically, to be advisors to the federal government and any agency that may need help from the federal government. I mean, this is incredible. Dr. Michael Mann, congratulations, sir. Michael Mann, MANN.net, by the way, is the website. Michael, thank you so much for being with us today, and congratulations.
Thank you, Tom. Always a pleasure, my friend.
I have a bunch of questions. The first, and I think this is a kind of a broad one for you being one of the top climate scientists on the planet, is has this level of economic shutdown, we were warned 2-3 years ago that we had 10 years. The IPCC said, you guys don't get your emissions down to this level within 10 years, all hell is going to break loose. And I'm wondering, I take a walk now, the sky is clear, I can see Mount Hood down 100 miles away as if it was next door. There are literally no jet trails in the sky. We live near an airport, maybe one plane takes off an hour. Are we there yet? I mean, has the coronavirus shut down world activity Has it taken us to 100% of the IPCC's goal for 2020, or are we only 50%? I mean, and what does this tell us about what we need to do going forward to achieve those goals?
Yeah, all great questions. And the reality is, somewhat sobering. What feels like a shutdown of our entire economy, and certainly a very substantial decrease in transportation and carbon emissions generated from transportation. What seems like life-changing changes in lifestyle have only gotten us about maybe 6 to 8% reduction in carbon emissions. And we need to bring those carbon emissions down by 10% every year for the next decade if we're going to avoid crossing that threshold of dangerous planetary warming. So that gives you an idea of the challenge, the monumental challenge that we face here. Even these, what feel like draconian changes in lifestyle haven't even gotten us the 10% that we need for this year, and then we've got to go beyond that, another 10% next year, and even further cuts, another 10% the next year. What this drives home for me, and I think a lot of my colleagues, is that individual behavioral change, it's part of the solution, but that alone isn't going to get us where we need to go. If we're going to achieve those sorts of reductions, then we need support at the highest level. We need governmental policies that will incentivize a shift away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and we need politicians, right, who are actually going to support those policies, who are going to do what's right for us and the planet rather than what's in the best interest of the powerful vested interests who often fund their campaigns.
So it sounds to me like the essence of what you're saying, Dr. Mann, is that we have used a relatively blunt instrument, this brute force thing of everybody just stay home for 3 months now to bend the curve down by 6%. But we've got to hit 10%. The Republicans and the fossil fuel industry are going to say, okay, you've got another Great Depression as a result of just 6%, and you want more? And your response sounds to me like what you're saying is, yes, we can get a larger carbon emission reduction without the Great Depression by doing it smart instead of doing it with a sledgehammer.
That's exactly right, Tom. In fact, it's the opposite, right, of what the talking points of the critics would hold. Actually, as we know, moving to renewable energy generates all sorts of new jobs. It's good for the economy. And obviously, it's much better for the planet. So it's a win-win. There's no reason not to do it. The only obstacle right now is, as I alluded to, the fact that we have fossil fuel interests who are currently essentially running our government under the Trump administration. We need to replace that government. We have an election coming up in months. We need to vote in politicians who will act on this problem before it's too late, before we truly do destroy the livability of this planet for future generations.
Yeah, well, given that a coal lobbyist is running the Environmental Protection Agency and an oil lobbyist is running the Interior Department, I would say we're at full capture here. Another story that has been haunting me is, and it's popped up all over the place. It started in the science magazines and it's migrated into the popular press, is that the so-called wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius. This is... wet bulb is where basically it's so hot and the humidity is so high that humans cannot evaporate perspiration enough to cool themselves down. It's the old, it doesn't feel hot in Arizona because the air is so dry. But, even 10 degrees, even something in the 90s rather than in the hundreds, if you're surrounded by 80% humidity, will kill you. That this is going to be the new normal for much of the equatorial regions of the planet and could endanger literally billions of humans. Can you tell us about that? What is the state of this science? How certain is it? What kind of time frame are you looking at?
Yeah, sure. So this recent study highlights this problem, but it's something that we've known. The fact is a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture. So in general, you get more humid conditions in places like the tropics. And it gets hotter. So it gets hotter and more humid. And we all know from our own experiences that it's those very hot, very humid summer days that really do a number on us, that make it very difficult to be outside, to be active. And as you allude to, that becomes the new normal. Think of the hottest, most humid summer day you've ever experienced. We'll simply call that summer by mid-century. That will be the typical conditions that we expect to see in the summer here, even in the mid-latitudes, if we continue on the path that we're on. And there are regions, a large swath in the tropics, where that combination of heat and humidity will literally be deadly. It will be too hot and humid for human beings. And so what we're talking about, as we all know, is less space, less land for us because the tropics become unlivable, because our coastlines become flooded. Some of our largest coastal regions become flooded because of sea level rise. So there's less land, there's less fresh water, there's less food, and there's 7.8 billion and growing people on this planet. That's a prescription for a disaster if we don't do something now.
And by doing something, I'm assuming you're talking about getting carbon emissions under control.
Yeah, I'm talking about voting Donald Trump out of office, of course. But no, absolutely. That's the first step. But what we need, indeed, is policies at the highest level. We need the U.S. to actually become a leader again when it comes to the worldwide effort to avert catastrophic climate change. And we had that leadership under Barack Obama. Sure, we can fault certain policies here or there, but we were on the right track. And of course, under Trump, we've headed off in the wrong direction now.
Yeah, and nobody was denying climate science. Dr. Michael Mann, his most recent book, The Madhouse Effect, his website, michaelmann.net, MANN.net, and you can tweet him at Michael Mann. Dr. Mann, thanks so much for dropping by today. It's great talking with you. It's always great talking with you. Thank you.
You too, Tom. Thanks.
Have a good one. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
15 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. Stick around. And welcome back. Terry in Hilo, Hawaii, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Terry, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, you know what we talked about last week about they using, McConnell was using that virus to suppress the vote? There's this little known news group that Trump has in his press conference that is spreading that lie on Facebook and Twitter that Democrats are doing that.
Right, you're talking about One America News?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And they're using that and turning it around, so they're projecting like Trump does all the time.
Well, this is an old trick. It's not just something that Republicans do. It's something that con men do as well. And it's something that criminals frequently do is, when you get caught doing something wrong, you accuse the other people of doing what you're doing.
And that's what he is. He is a con man. He's a con man. And I take everything you say and then all your literature to heart, man. Tom.
Thank you, Terry. Are you actually seeing news stories that are published by One America News Network, OANN, on Facebook and in other venues, or are they simply being referred to? Are they doing the outreach, or is somebody else pushing their message?
No. Trump is praising them and putting them up and tweeting about them, and they're spreading that message.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
so it's a symbiosis.
what is that? Matter of fact, Trump always calls on that woman in the crowd in the press conferences.
Yeah, I'm with you. Thank you, Terry. Carol in Manassas, Pennsylvania. Hey, Carol, thank you for watching Free Speech TV. What's up?
Hi, Tom. Yeah, I really enjoyed Dr. Mann. He's very, very knowledgeable. I feel that it's really kind of sad that with Trump in office and all these supporters of Trump, the cultists, that they are denying both the COVID-19 and climate change. And either one of those two things can do us all in. I really believe that. But as far as the climate change goes, I've noticed it. I mean, I've been around a while. Not to say how old I am, but I have been around a while. And I can remember when things were very different. And we were walking up our hill the other day, and I saw animals that I have not seen in, God, decades. There was a big old groundhog standing like a sentinel by our fence. I mean, it was so funny. He was just standing there. And I've seen red squirrels. I've seen just so many, woodpecker with the red head, things I have never seen in years.
Saw a coyote. Sean saw a coyote driving into work this morning.
Oh, for heaven's sake. We had 2 deer here the other day, just by our tree. I mean, it's just remarkably different. And when you're outside, the air feels so different and smells different. Mm-hmm. But now, as far as the climate goes, I mean, I definitely am not a climate denier. But I have to say, we have been freezing to death here in May in western Pennsylvania. Now, I know you said it was hot yesterday in Oregon, but we're freezing here.
Yeah, but one of the ways that the climate change shows up is in abnormal cold, just like abnormal heat. And, you guys got that bomb cyclone thing on the East Coast. That's because the jet stream is collapsing. The jet stream is collapsing because the Arctic ice is melting. So that's why you got cold, Carol. Carol, I got to run, but thank you for the call. Marvelous. Animals.
Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. So we've got a new video up for regular supporters of our program over at thomhartmann.com, and this is about just a totally bizarre story about these 3 guys with no VA experience, not even veterans, who are all big shots down at Mar-a-Lago, that Donald Trump has put in charge of the Veterans Administration functionally. And their association, one of them is the head of Marvel Entertainment, their association with Johnson & Johnson and the New York Stock Exchange, and Johnson & Johnson, the big drug company, taking this very, very cheap chemical, ketamine, tweaking the molecule a little bit, and rolling it out as a new anti-suicide drug, Spravato, that in clinical trials caused 6 people to die, 3 of them by suicide, and none of the people taking the placebo to die. And now Trump is telling the VA, you have to buy this highly inflated price drug from Johnson & Johnson, and the Democrats want to know what's up with the VA crowd guys. Check it out. It's at thomhartmann.com.
The clean phone, Tom. Speaking of science and politics, the United States spent millions of dollars. My recollection was 49 million, maybe it was 74 million. But whatever it was millions and millions of dollars to help develop this drug, remdesivir, which was developed originally to deal with SARS and MERS. And, well, actually, I believe it was originally developed to deal with the Ebola virus. It's an antiviral drug. And then they thought, okay, well, maybe it could work against SARS and MERS, and so they started doing some of those studies, and that led them to think, well, maybe this could even work against the coronavirus. A company by the name of Gilead has acquired the rights to the drug that was developed with your money and mine, and they are now telling us that they're going to give us being the entire United States, enough of this drug to treat 78,000 hospitalized patients. That is not enough to cover all Americans. There are more than 300,000 eligible patients in the United States. 300,000 people hospitalized. If I'm reading this news story from Bloomberg.com, here's what it says. I quote it. This is by Kristen Flanagan. More than 300,000 eligible patients in the U.S. will not have access to the Foster City, California-based company's treatment through the end of July. That and continued limited supply through almost the end of the year could put pressure on state health departments, according to Abrams. That's Brian Abrams, who is an RBC analyst. He's looking at the profit, the company and their stock price and all that kind of stuff. He says initial supply of remdesivir is likely to be constrained to an even greater degree than we had previously estimated. Worldwide, they're going to distribute 1.5 million vials. We get 78,000 patients, enough for 78,000 people. That's 607,000 vials. Isn't that nice of them? Meanwhile, the Fed is expanding their protocols. I guess my question for the day is, how much longer are we going to have to endure this Ayn Randization of our politics? I told the story a little earlier to one of our callers, but I think it bears repeating. Phil Proctor, one of the original Firesign Theater guys, well, he's still with the Firesign Theater. They're still around. He's a friend, and he sent me an email a couple days ago, a cartoon. And it was a father and son in the son's bedroom, and they were sitting on the bed talking. And the father had this book in his hand, or some magazine. He had something in his hand that looked kind of like a book or a pile of magazines. And the kid's got this really concerned look on his face, and dad's got kind of a grim look on his face. And the caption says, has dad speaking, and dad is saying to his teenage son, he's saying, I don't care about the porno magazines or the tobacco or the cigarettes. I want to know where you got this copy of Ayn Rand's book. And it was like, right. I mean, that's what's destroying America, right? In the first hour, I was talking about, Republicans don't believe in governance. They don't believe in government. They say government is the cause of your problems. It's not the solution. Don't look to government for solution. If you want solutions to your problem, look to the billionaires. Look to the big corporations. They'll take care of you after they make themselves insanely rich. They'll take care of you, not to worry. And apparently that idea is continuing. Down in Dallas, you'll recall, back, a month or two ago, Donald Trump had this big hoop-de-doop in the White House on the West Lawn, where he brought out these CEOs from these various companies, from Walmart, Walgreens and Walmart and whatever. I mean, just a bunch of, well-known American retail brands, and said, we're going to set up coronavirus testing spots, drive-through testing stations in thousands of locations across the United States. Now, of course, he was lying through his teeth, as Trump does whenever he speaks. But his saying that caused his team and and some of his billionaire corporate backers to say, well, we really should create a couple of these. I think they set up either 7 or 9 of them nationwide. It's a very small number. I know it's fewer than 15. My recollection is it was either 7 or 9 of them. 2 of them were in Dallas County. And those 2, according to a judge, Judge Clay Jenkins, Dallas County judge, says those 2 testing sites, which are testing 1,000 people a day right now in Dallas, Texas, he says the feds are getting out of testing. They're going to shut these things down. Dallas County just reported 2 more deaths yesterday, by the way. These opened on the weekend of March 21st at the American Airlines Center near downtown and Ellis Davis Fieldhouse in the Red Bird area. Each one can conduct 500 tests a day. But Donald Trump has decided, we don't need no stinking testing. We're just going to try to infect everybody in America, and we'll let the old people and the poor people die, and then all the good, healthy white people will have herd immunity, and we'll be back to an economy that works.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Do you think he's going to pull it off? I think he is, as awful as that sounds, I think he's setting us up for a huge second wave.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Stand Up, Struggle Forward by Sanyika Shakur. This is a book that was written back in the late 90s, but it's still very, very timely. This is from the second chapter titled Class Antagonisms Inside the Fundamental Contradiction of National Oppression. Having just passed the 19th and quickly approaching the 20th anniversary of the LA Rebellion, we should be reminded here of what Rodney King whimpered as he stood in front of a bank of microphones surrounded by class enemies and neo-colonial politicians. We should remember how he'd been dressed in that non-threatening cardigan sweater, white shirt, and black tie, how his hair had been tortured into submission by a jerry curl. We should reflect as well upon how timid and spooked he looked, and on how concerned and stern those who flanked him were as well. That was a Kodak moment. It was staged to foster an image of contrition and resignation, submission, a victim. Rodney King had been led to believe, through a bourgeois sense of reasoning, that the rebellion was really about him, that the reason new Africans and Mexicanos took to the streets of South Central was the result of his filmed beating. That, of course, is typical of mechanical bourgeois thinking. What it's not typical of, however, is someone from the hood. And this cuts both ways. No one in the hoods and barrios ever thought it was about Rodney King. We'd all seen the film over and over like everyone else, but that was par for the course. We'd always seen that, long before anybody caught it on tape. Actually, we'd experienced much more than that. Why, it's safe to say that the hoods had gone to war with each other in vicious waves of internal, intra-class combat for much less than that, though because of a general colonial mentality which prevents the challenging of bottom-up oppression, the same hood forces will not, in any systemic way, wage war on the pigs, or for freedom, land, and socialism. Rodney King alone, and of his own accord, would not have thought to hold a press conference to ask the asinine question, in the form of a whimpering request, can't we just all get along? The fact of the matter is, we are getting along. New Africans and Mexicanos are getting along just fine. What we couldn't understand was why he was admonishing us for getting at the exploiters of our communities. The impression he gave, with his handler's hands up his back like a ventriloquist troll, was that a race riot was going on, as if we had all begun to kill each other or burn and rob each other's homes. His handlers compelled him to send up a false flag, a diversion. But you see, this was the very thing that exposed the class interests and reactionary politics of the Uncle Toms that had been designated to handle him, and by extension, us. Let's go back for a minute. Let's talk social development, aka history. There exists a fundamental contradiction in our lives that, like an elephant in the room, no one wants to acknowledge. As a consequence of the war waged upon various African nations by European powers, those of us captured and kidnapped were taken out of our own self-determining social developments and violently forced into Euro-American history. This is not simply a clever play on words. This is a reality. We lost the ability to control our own destiny. Read that again. From that time until now, the fundamental basic contradiction between the U.S. oppressor nation and our own oppressed and colonized nation has been the governing imperialist relationship, which is to say, us not being in control of the qualitative factors that determine our lives as a people, as a nation. Our tradition of struggle against this fundamental contradiction has taken many forms, some hidden or obscured, some open and hostile. But all of these have been open to resolve the fundamental contradiction and to regain our independence. While there have been some bona fide struggles to resolve the contradiction, there have also been reactionary neocolonial struggles waged by internal enemies loyal to the oppressor nation and culture that have tried time and time again to subvert and control our destiny for the benefit of the capitalists. They've come among us, always imposed from above, stirring up emotions and giving lip service to progress, equality, justice, and prosperity. These always within the colonial confines of the oppressor's arrangements, and none collectively ever materialize. Because without a resolution of the fundamental contradiction, that is the freeing of our productive forces from U.S. imperialism and the governing of our own affairs, we'll remain a minority within the American system as opposed to a majority in our own, and subjected to the established bourgeois social contract, i.e. colonialism, neo and post. We can parade all through the empire with black congressmen, black mayors, black governors, black police chiefs, black Supreme Court justices, hell, even a black president. And absolutely nothing will alter the genocidal relationship that governs our national oppression here, because the blacks are part of the colonial apparatus. They have made a strategic alliance with the capitalist imperialists to act as go-betweens in our oppression and exploitation. This is a conscious class stand. The black petty bourgeois is not innocently confused, like, say, Mrs. Jackson across the street is, about our national oppression, about the existence and subjugation subjugation of New Africa. They are well-read, have traveled in our experience. They've just chosen sides against us and in favor of our historical enemies. And the sooner we recognize and internalize this, the better off we'll be. Black ain't nothing but a color. As a designation of our national identity, it has played out. It is a superficial understanding at best and a foolish and dangerous analysis at worst. We have no collective control over the qualitative factors which determine our lives. We do not, in other words, control our destiny, not as a people or a state. The book is Stand Up, Struggle Forward by Sanyika Shakur.
So the story that we've been told by rich people in the United States, these libertarian billionaires for years and years and years, is that if we just got rid of government and didn't think about all of us being in this little kind of boat together here, the free market and individual enterprise will take care of problems. It'll solve everything. We're starting to see the outlines of that solution now. Margaret Thatcher famously said, there's no such thing as society, it's just a collection of individuals. That is the libertarian sales pitch. So what happens when the libertarians have their way, as they have had for the last 40 years in the United States since the election of Ronald Reagan and the ending of Keynesian economics in the United States? They have successfully prevented us from having a national health care system. They have successfully prevented us from having a strong social safety net. So when depressions happen or epidemics happen, people have liberate caught as they fall. Essentially, they don't end up homeless or hungry or without calling for like armed revolt or asking his crazy followers to let's send some pipe bombs or something like one already has to Democrats. He did that 2 minutes after watching a Fox News segment basically saying the same thing. Fox News is programming the brain of the president, and their programming was, basically developed by Roger Ailes to infuriate people. This outrage as a way of holding people so that they can sell advertising. And it's doing harm to our republic. You can check the whole thing out, the whole new video, over at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you and Dave in Steilacoom, Washington. Hey, Dave, what's up?
Hey, morning, Tom. How you doing there? Hey, thanks for having Dr. Mann on. Regarding climate change, there's really no single magic bullet. Greenhouse gas reduction, yeah, it's huge, very important. But you know what? It's only half the solution. What's the other half? Carbon sequestration. We need to protect the trees, protect the meadows that filter out the carbon and produce oxygen. If we do one without the other, guess what? It ain't going to work. We need both.
Yeah.
And, forests, trees, not only sequester out, filter out carbon and produce oxygen, but wildlife habitat, stress reduction, all sorts of beneficial, psychodynamic benefits from trees and leaving the green stuff alone. We need to stop clear cutting, stop replacing forests with huge parking lots that don't produce any oxygen,
Yeah. In the first year of its existence, the Franklin Roosevelt Civilian Conservation Corps planted over 1 million trees. That is carbon sequestration. You're absolutely right, and that's another step. And and there's a bunch of other pieces to this, but let's start there. David in Neckline, Wisconsin. Hey, David, what's up?
Good afternoon, Tom. Really quickly, so I just want to bring attention to your listeners. Michael Moore obviously came out with this film a couple of weeks ago debunking a lot of what renewable energy is called Planet
Yeah, and then the film got debunked. That film is so filled with inaccuracies and errors. In fact, in essence, what the film is saying is as if back in 1895, somebody said, yeah, this light bulb from Thomas Edison, it only burns for about 12 minutes, and, we should just go back to candles. I mean, that video is an abomination.
So let me just point out to you really quickly, on the BBC website, Matt McGrath, September 13th of 2019, he talks about the electrical industry's dirty secret that actually boosts warming. And it's in regard with the chemical sulfur hexafluoride, SF6, and that is a gas that's 22,000 times worse than CO2, and that is used for wind farms because you have to obviously connect the electrical grid to obviously different factories and what have you, and that is an actual article that was written. So I would point out,
David, there are. Let me take this. When I went to college, I studied electrical engineering. I'm a licensed electrical engineer, broadcast engineer, at least I was for many years, ham radio operator, other things. The chemical, the largest source of dioxin in our environment, for example, for a long, long time, was the chemicals that were used to cool transformers that were on the poles near your house. And that's what you're talking about. You're talking about the chemistry associated with electronics, particularly high temperature, high voltage electronics. And once we figured out how destructive those chemicals were, we fixed it. Edison created a light bulb that wasn't very efficient, and now we have LEDs. The big argument of this so-called documentary that Michael Moore didn't make it, a friend of his made it, and Moore just put his name on it, and, which in my opinion was a huge mistake. But basically the big argument is it's not perfect yet, so screw it. And it's a terrible argument. It's a pathetic argument. And looking for little instances of, let's pick apart green energy here. Let's pick apart green energy there. I mean, the one good point that movie made was that biomass is a scam. Sure. I mean, that was, 60% of the movie. Then he extended that logic to everything else, which is not a scam. We've got industries that are moving forward. In fact, they had some solar panels in there that were very, very inefficient because they were like solar panels in the 70s or 80s. And he's like, that'll only power a toaster. Well, actually, it would have powered a couple of houses, but, so that was a lie. But on top of that, those were old technology. I just, it troubles me when, right-wingers come on this program and say, green energy is a scam. We shouldn't be doing green energy. We just need to keep burning that oil that Charles Koch's refinery down there is processing. Just keep burning that. It troubles me when conservatives say it. I think it's bizarre when people who say that they're progressives say it. I don't know how to deal with that. Rob in Chico, California. Hey, Rob, what's up?
Hi, Tom. How do you come up with, you mentioned earlier that $3 million, the tax rate should be 90%. And I don't know if you're talking about federal or total tax, but
federal.
Federal income tax. Why not 100,000? Why not 50,000? I mean, how do you get 3 million? You just kind of think that's about enough for everybody?
I'm basing that on the historical tax rates. If you take the top tax rate in the 1950s and the early 60s, which was 91%, and you look at how much money you had to earn to hit that, and it was a couple $100,000 as I recall. I'd have to go back and look. It's been quite a few years since I wrote about this. But my recollection is that if you take that amount back then, that amount of income, and you inflation adjust it, in today's world, it would be roughly $3 million. It might be a little more than that. It might be 4, 5, 6 million,
but
something like that.
Why? How do you base that? As if $3 million
because that's
is
what
enough
worked
for anybody?
That's what worked for our country.
$3 million is the amount that is satisfactory to everybody. I'm
because that's what worked for our country, Rob. For 40 years, we had a top tax rate like that.
Zero science.
And
why don't you? Why do you want to raise as much tax as you can rather than raise the tax that you need? You would just like as much money into the federal coffers as possible. That's just so ridiculous.
Rob, you're making assertions that have no basis in fact. My point is that for 40 years in this country, we had a tax system that reduced inequality. You had the middle class actually growing in wealth at a faster rate, not a larger amount, but at a faster rate between 1940 and 1980. The middle class grew in wealth at a faster rate than did the top 5%. That all got reversed with Reagan's reversal. If you look at the countries of Northern Europe that are doing just fine, thank you very much. Denmark right now has a 4.5% unemployment rate. Norway's in good shape. Sweden's in relatively good shape. You look at those countries, they have a similar tax structure. And it works. It historically works. When you drop that top tax rate below 50%, and I would say if you're looking for a magic number, that's it. When you drop that top tax rate below 50% for people making over 3, 4, 5, 10 million, whatever number you want to pull out of your backside, whether it's $100,000 or $100 million, whatever. Actually, it would have to be a hell of a lot less than $100 million.
Don't give me that.
Rob, I'm going to cut you off here. It's, if you look at how this works, what you find is that inequality is destructive to society. This is not about trying to shovel as much money as possible into the federal coffers. The fact of the matter is that when people are looking at a 91% top tax rate, they don't make enough to hit it. I've told this story before. Back in the 1970s, when we had that top tax rate, Terry O'Connor and I owned a company in Okemos, Michigan, in Lansing, Michigan, an herbal tea company, and we had a real successful product. And we made, for 2 years, we made a whole pile of money. And I remember our bookkeeper sitting down with us, and my dad was in the meeting. He helped, he taught Louise how to do double entry bookkeeping. But our CPA sat us down and said, you guys are starting to hit 40, 50% income tax rates on the money you're taking out of this company. And you will find that if you keep that money in the company instead and grow your business, over time, you're going to be way ahead of the game. And so we did that. We developed a new product line, and we hired a few more people. We went from 12 employees to 18 employees. We gave our employees a raise. And sure enough, we made even more money. I mean, this is just common sense stuff. Taxes act as essentially a regulator against greed. And out of control greed, which was celebrated, not just introduced, but celebrated by Ronald Reagan, and this has been the case basically since 82, 83, since Reagan dropped the top tax rate down to 25%, is destroying the middle class.
Listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Or let me be more precise, has destroyed the middle class. And the way you deal with unregulated greed is you regulate it with taxes. They have prevented all those things from happening. And now we're looking at And welcome back. Let's see here. Boy, what a day, huh? Tony in Yucaipa, California. Am I saying that right?
Yucaipa, California. Thank you, Tom, for receiving me.
Sure.
Tom, it's been 30 years that I've been observing and studying the extremely atomized and divided working class progressive forces of this nation, which I learned to love, and at the same time, it is very hard to love it. Because it saddens me profoundly how recently Bernie Sanders came and offered a common agenda that will help the whole of the progressive forces and the working class of this nation to unite under a common set of demands, which will have united the most important forces of this nation, the youth, the proletariat in general. I mean, forgive my Spanish.
Broadly speaking, I agree with you, Tony. What's your point? Where are you going with this?
My point is this. I wonder how fully are you aware of the extreme danger the nation runs currently, because we're deep into the Weimar kind of republic, stage. This guy doesn't need gas chambers. He's enough with an executive order to force the workers to spread the virus and die in mass. This guy doesn't need Treblinka or Auschwitz, because he's got a whole system of prisons and cages for the immigrants, and have them die and profit out of it, because the prison system is for profit. This guy is run with impunity in everything he wants. Just today, you will most probably witness how a mostly conservative Supreme Court will give him more, will embolden him more to keep on with impunity attacking the working class of America, the poor.
We'll see, but certainly, Thomas and Kavanaugh and Gorsuch look like they're trying to go down that road, and Alito's trying to help it out. But again, what's your point? What's your call for action, Tony?
My point is this. Why do you, with the American people, keep on divided? Just recently, look, the blacks, the African American community decided to support the past, Biden, instead of supporting the only political force that was capable of uniting most of America. Why do you keep on so divided? Why don't you realize
the divisions in our society, Tony, are coming out in large part, are coming out of very wealthy interests who have been empowered by the U.S. Supreme Court to own politicians, who have built media monopolies that control large chunks of the American media landscape, who have no interest in small d democracy. They want oligarchy. They want control. They want it all. And Tony, I'm sorry, we're out of time. But this is where the division is coming from. And the reason why you don't recall America being divided like this, except for the era leading up to the Civil War, is that America hasn't been an oligarchy like this, except for the period leading up to the Civil War. And that was in the South, where oligarchy had replaced democracy. We'll be back. Did you know that Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president in 1980, and George Herbert Walker Bush was in on it, and he avoided being prosecuted for this in 1992 with a little help from Bill Barr? It's on page 116 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. So Donald Trump has just deployed Patriot missiles to Iraq and pointed them at Iran, has gone out of his way to threaten Iran, saying that they will pay a very heavy price. If any of their proxy groups, any of the Iranian-supported militias or groups, this is basically the Shiites, the majority of the population of Iraq. In Iraq, if any of them were to attack American forces, Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo will use this as an excuse to launch a war against Iran. This is insane. The New York Times is reporting military commanders, the Pentagon has ordered military commanders to plan for an escalation of American combat in Iraq, in the region, and, quote, prepare a campaign to destroy an Iranian-backed militia group that has threatened more attacks against American troops. We crippled their country with sanctions, and now we're threatening a war so that Trump can get reelected. There's a video about it over at thomhartmann.com for our supporters. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Josh in Madison, Wisconsin. Hey, Josh, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, that was quick. I just wanted to let you know that they opened up free public testing in Wisconsin yesterday, and I just got my test done.
Really? Tell me about it.
Smooth. Well, there were about 100 cars there, and the line's just kind of cycling. The whole thing took about a half an hour for a wait. I should have used the bathroom first, but the actual test itself took 3 seconds. Everything was super smooth. It was like ET, basically. Like, there was no contact at all. Everyone had, like, full-on suits. The entire nostril swab thing took 3 seconds.
Wow. And it didn't hurt?
No, not at all. I mean, it's uncomfortable. I wouldn't want to do it every day, but, you do it for 3 seconds, then you never need to think about it. Like, I could have done it myself, honestly.
So when do you get your results, Josh?
I believe they said 2 to 3 days, which is reasonable, I guess. I mean, I would rather just know. And then at this point, I wouldn't want to get tested more than once every week or whatever, or once a month. But just getting it done initially so you have a baseline is awesome. And then at least you know.
So who's running this and who's paying for it?
I believe it's the National Guard. That is what the people that I talked to had said. I'd imagine it's just regular, good old-fashioned Wisconsin taxpayer money. I think it's a great way to spend it, honestly.
All right, so this is presumably something Governor Evers helped set up.
Yes, there was an article, I think, that went out a couple of days ago about it. I don't know a ton about it, but the experience was really good. And I was wondering if you'd heard about self-administered tests and if that's been made available anywhere.
The only self-administered tests that I have heard of being available are not antigen tests. They're not tests looking for the virus or particles of the virus itself. They are antibody tests. They're measuring whether your body has produced, antibodies, things to kill a virus. And because the FDA chose not to regulate them when they allowed them into the marketplace, there was something like over 80 manufacturers rolling them out, and many of them don't work, or they're very unreliable, or they've got lots and lots of false positives, which is a terrible thing because people will think they're immune when they're not. And the FDA has now pulled back on that, and they're saying to those companies, you have a certain number of days, and I'm sorry I don't know the time period, but it's it's supposed to be relatively short, to prove that the test that you're selling actually does some good. So my understanding, Josh, is that they're not ready for prime time yet. I wouldn't buy one.
But that is too bad. I was
probably
thinking if you could
within
give
a
those
few
away
months they're going to be all over.
Yeah, if you could give those away for free, like at protests, for example, or if you could mail them to people and they could mail them into testing centers, that would be a great way to preserve the postal service. Just say, I'll give you.
Yeah, when they get them really straightforward, where it's like a pregnancy test, where you put a little drop of blood or a little drop of saliva on the thing, and you wait 15 minutes, and the line either turns purple or blue or red or whatever. Then I think that we're going to be way down the road, and frankly, I think that by this fall we'll probably be there. I mean, that's just capitalism is capable of responding to opportunities in a fairly quick fashion, and that's what we're seeing happen right now. The Trump administration put their faith in the capital markets rather than allowing government to do this. So we're months behind, but there will be a robust response. As there is around the world. Other companies are allowing their companies to do this too. So anyhow, Josh, thanks for sharing your story with us. It's fascinating to hear and good news, for folks living in Wisconsin. That's so cool. Mark in Sauk City, Wisconsin. Another Wisconsin call. Hey, Mark, what's up?
Yeah, it just strikes me as ironic that considering that Ayn Rand got her start in writing, working for the WPA, because back in the WPA days, they're actually paying for artists and writers and all sorts of other stuff, to keep the economy going. And
did she get? I didn't remember that. She got a WPA grant to be a writer.
No, she was. I guess she was working. She did WPA work back in the day. As I think I read that at some point in time. Huh. But I do know that at the end of her wretched life, she relied on Medicare and Social Security to survive on, and that considering that so supposedly she shouldn't have needed that because she was she was a maker rather than a taker. And as far as I know, she made some ridiculous novels where the guys that were successful were rich when they started out. Well, of course they're going to be successful. I mean, of course your fictional character will turn out to be successful if you write it like that. And it strikes me, that you're making the point here, and I turn back to Hamilton again, that how he closed his Federalist Papers, and this is, these are a couple sentences a bit apart, but a nation without a national government, in my view, is an awful spectacle. And that he ends it with, I know that powerful individuals in this and other states are enemies to a general national government in every possible shape. And these people are actually enemies of the Republic. I mean, the guys that are running
Which Federalist paper is that from?
That's 85. That's how he closes 85. Up the Federalist paper. I mean and he is just prescient in what he wrote there is that they are enemies of the Republic. I mean, I've said this on this program before, I think, and on other programs, but that is simply, it's got to be drilled into people's heads. I mean, that these guys are enemies of our country.
Yeah, and Trump likes to call the press the enemy of the people. He is the real representative of the enemy of democracy itself. It's so unfortunate. Mark, thank you for that. And, I'll be looking up Federalist 85 here when we get off the air. Hitting the top of the hour. We'll be back in just a moment, and we're going to be checking in with Lori Wallach.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Here's how I feel.
We say fight back!
So we've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who support our program, and there's a really troubling concatenation of events events that are happening in the United States right now. We created these concentration camps for refugees seeking asylum. This was Stephen Miller's big project. And we've got concentration camps for children, concentration camps for male adults, concentration camps for female adults. And now we've got this virus sweeping through the United States, and people are starting to die in these concentration camps, which has provoked ICE or whoever's running them to deport hundreds of the children back to the countries that they came from without their parents, which is mind-boggling, and in many cases carrying disease. This is serious stuff, and we need to be talking about it. The new video is over at thomhartmann.com.
I'm recording. Yeah.
Our book today is The Hermit King, The Dangerous Game of Kim Jong-un by Chung Min Lee. This is from the first chapter, Life in Earth's Paradise. Whenever a North Korean is asked by a foreign journalist or visitor what life is like inside North Korea, the reply is that the country's citizens live in an earthly paradise for one reason: the care given to them by the supreme leader. He is their father and provider. They lack for nothing, nor do they desire anything else. The supreme leader makes sure that they are totally happy. Just like the Heavenly Father in Christianity, it is the living head of the Kim family that makes everything possible in North Korea. This is a total lie, except for the super elites who are bound inextricably with the regime, including the creme de la creme of the party, armed forces, security agencies, and hard currency-making enterprises. The vast majority of North Koreans must fend for themselves. Life was not always like this in North Korea. While it's impossible to imagine today, North Korea had a higher GDP than South Korea until the early 1970s. In 2017, South Korea's GDP was 1.5 trillion, whereas North Korea's was 33 billion. Per capita GDP was $30,000 in South Korea, $1,300 in North Korea. Still, North Koreans are routinely told that South Korea is filled with beggars and only a tiny percentage of corrupt capitalists live well. Excuse me. The rest of the population ekes out the barest of livings in squalid conditions. Because the country is a stooge of the American imperialists, South Korean women are constantly raped by American soldiers, Pyongyang's propagandists claim, and the people are yearning for liberation by North Korea. Even the government-funded Russian international television network, RT, which has prided itself as a mouthpiece of the Putin regime, believes that North Korean propaganda has gone a step too far. A 2017 RT documentary called The Happiest People on Earth, North Korea, the rulers, the people, and the official narrative, offers the outside world a peek into that nation. A factory manager recounts her emotions when Kim Jong-un made an on-site inspection visit in January 2016. Quote, "When the great Marshal Kim Jong-un opened the windows and walked in, we beheld his sun-like image. It was like a dream, as if I was the only one who enjoyed this great honor." She continues with straight face, "The entire factory and workshop filled with sunlight when the great Marshal arrived." The film crew captures a scene of students studying in the famous Kim Chak University of Technology. Since most North Korean men have to spend 10 years in the Army before they can enroll at a university, male students at Kim Chak are typically in their late 20s or early 30s. One student says, "Thanks to the great leader and the Marshal General's revolutionary course, our country became the strongest country in the world." With a big smile, the student goes on to say, "All stooges who dare attack our sovereignty are our enemies." Each year, the nation busies itself preparing for the celebration of Kim Il-sung's birthday on April 15th, called the Day of the Sun. The film crew captured citizens gathering in a plaza to pledge their loyalty to Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. After they take their vows, first-grade children goose-step to martial music, and the child leading the formation raises her right arm in a 45-degree salute, just like the goose-stepping members of the armed forces. A middle school orphanage official tells the film crew that the great Marshal Kim Jong-un spent 2 hours visiting the school. In the entrance, you see a giant mural depicting the floor plan of the orphanage. The point where Kim began his inspection is marked with a red star, and his footsteps are marked in red arrows. The entire room is devoted to pictures and relics of his visit. The red and yellow blanket that Kim touched and the white chair with the blue cushion he sat in are boxed in glass. Everything he touches is preserved as a holy remnant, just as was done with anything his father or grandfather touched. This is how the state wants to portray the average North Korean, filled with undying love for the Kim family, finding truth only in the teachings of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, and receiving guidance in everything from the current Supreme Leader, Kim Jong-un. The truth is, every North Korean has an avatar, because how the avatar behaves can mean the difference between life and death. The avatar is for public consumption, what is shown to most friends, relatives, and co-workers. A North Korean can show his or her innermost secrets to just a handful of people, perhaps immediate family members, trustworthy relatives, and best friends who have committed a common crime like watching a South Korean movie. The dark side of North Korea, the state argues, is simply fake news, conjured up by the capitalist West and enemies of the state. But right beneath the veneer of 25 million smiling North Koreans lies a darkness that fills every square meter of the DPRK. There are at least 4 gulags in North Korea, where between 200 and 300,000 political prisoners and their families are held. Officially, the state says there are no political prisoners. An Moy-Shol was a guard in Camp 22, no longer in operation, and one of the few guards who escaped to South Korea. He was trained to see prisoners not as human beings, but as animals. In fact, prisoners got smaller rations than the dogs reared by guards. Prisoners shouldn't make eye contact with instructors, recalls An. The book, The Hermit King by Chung Min Lee.
Very good.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And on the line with us, our buddy Lori Wallach. Lori is the big cheese, the executive director over at Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, citizen.org/trade or tradewatch.org. And you can tweet her at Wallach Lori or at PCGTW. Lori, welcome back. I'm so glad to have you with us. It's been a while since we've talked. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the current situation with pharmaceuticals. I years ago I bought some pharmaceuticals from a pharmacy in Canada, and I've been on their mailing list for years now. As a result of that, the price of the drug that I was taking has dropped somewhat here in the United States, ironically, weirdly. But in any case, but I'm still getting their newsletter, and they've been talking about how the supply chains have been badly interrupted, that 95% of the drugs coming into Canada and presumably North America are coming either from India or China. The raw ingredients are being made in China. The pills are being pressed in India. India has shut down because of the coronavirus. China's been holding back. Where are we at with all this stuff, and should Americans be concerned about our drug supply?
You know, Tom, you're spot on in that concern because, in a way, one of the pieces of strongest evidence of the failure of the hyper-globalized corporate-rigged trade system is that we have very little resilience or redundancy in the supply chain for medicines, for all the PPE. We saw the crisis with masks, with ventilators. So you are spot on. The U.S. Health and Human Services Department says that we are reliant 90% on imports for masks, 70% for respirators, and that 80% of all of the medicines, including the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the stuff that actually makes the medicines, are coming from either India or China.
Wow.
80%.
So my recollection is that back in the 60s, and I'm sure you know these numbers better than I do, and I'm doing this from old memory, but back sometime in the 60s or in that neighborhood of time, we passed, in order to help out Puerto Rico, we passed some real substantial tax breaks for particular categories of business. Pharmaceuticals were the largest. where if they located to Puerto Rico, their tax bill went down substantially. And so most of our drugs during the period from whenever that happened up until around 2000 were being manufactured down in Puerto Rico. But that at some point, I don't recall if it was the late 90s or the early 2000s, but somewhere in there, the free traders got a hold of this, and I don't know if this was partisan or not, and said, let's just do away with those tax breaks. They did away with the tax breaks. The factories, the drug factories in Puerto Rico shut down. Puerto Rico was thrown into a depression. The drug manufacturing all went to China and India, and now we're stuck with, we can't even get drugs in this hemisphere. Am I remembering that right?
You are remembering that right. And that tax policy was basically to spur investment in Puerto Rico, and it was eliminated. At the same time, it was sort of a conglomeration of bad things. That tax change happened, which removed the incentive to produce in Puerto Rico, but also we saw the WTO and Nafta go into place that gave these crazy guaranteed 20-year monopoly patents plus criminal penalties for their violation in countries around the world. So it was suddenly much safer with basically the U.S. government ensuring these monopoly protections for pharmaceutical outsourcers to go take their formulas and their medicines and make them someplace cheaper, at the same time as we domestically were generally creating incentives like tax benefits if you outsource, which Bush too did, and now Trump has doubled down where he charges 20% on corporate profits made in the U.S. and 10% on those made overseas. So all the incentives of exactly the wrong kind of behavior have us in a situation where we are untenably reliant on unreliable, super long, brittle, thin supply chains. Or even the whole ventilator story, everyone who's basically kind of scoffed at the elite lucky people who didn't lose a job with the 5 million manufacturing jobs you've lost in the last 20 years of those kind of policies. Why are you guys so worried about trade and where things are made? And suddenly everyone is saying, what do you mean we can't make or get the basic things we need? We're America. And then you explain hey, guys, we may have invented some of those ventilators, but the corporations, to make the biggest profit, they've got 100 key pieces, most of which are made offshore. So even if you wanted to get the manufacturing, the assembly happening, we set up a system where we've outsourced all the pieces, the parts. We're totally, totally vulnerable.
So right now, Donald, and thank you for giving the lie, by the way, to Trump's, one of his major sales pitches, particularly to the industrial Midwest, is, I'm changing our policies to encourage companies to bring their jobs back here, when in fact his replacement for Nafta cuts corporate taxes in half if you move your manufacturing to Mexico, as you just pointed out. But COVID-19 is kind of causing the world to rethink trade. It's coming on the back end of the whole Brexit thing. And we've got this very weird relationship between Donald Trump and China, where, he's trying to trash China for political purposes, but he's still making his Trump products in China. And his daughter, I'm assuming, I don't know what all is going on here, but tell me about this weird relationship between Trump and China.
Well, one of the key things to know is it's hard to know if it is nefarious self-dealing, could be, or if it's incompetence, could be, or it's a combination. Because here is a thing, Tom, that put down if you have hot tea in your hand, you want to throw it. In the beginning of January, the trade data shows clearly that China basically stopped exporting the masks, the ventilators, the gloves, the stuff, the medicine we're very overly, unreasonably, dangerously reliant on. So you can see that in the trade data. And at the same time, the Trump Commerce Department, in trying to prove the point that Trump's trade agreement with China has been a great, and luckily Congressman Lloyd Doggett caught one of these commerce alerts to a company was sent to him, and it's showing them trying to basically outsource the stuff that we need in the crisis as the imports that we're reliant on are no longer coming in. So if you go to our website, which is tradewatch.org, that's tradewatch.org, we have a whole new special feature on exactly what you said, which is how the COVID crisis is laying bare the structural disaster of globalization that many Americans and working people in developed countries and many people in developing countries understood, but that now is being laid bare for all of us trying to get through this crisis. And one of the things we did is we went back and ran the data that shows this kind of nefarious, strange duplicity with China, where you can see, it doesn't take a rocket scientist. We use the public data. You can see our exports are falling off of all these things we obviously are going to need in our country. At the same time, that we're pushing out the door to China exports of the same things that we don't make enough of to start. So that is just an example. I mean, again, people have said, do you think that was some kind of weird self-dealing thing, or do you think that was just stupidity? And I said, why do we have to make a choice?
Yeah. Well, what you're talking about is Trump shipping millions of pounds or tons or whatever it was of PPE to China in January, right?
And February and March.
Oh, my God. Lori Wallach, you can read all about it at tradewatch.org, the executive director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Lori, I always learn something from you. Thanks so much for dropping by today. It's great talking with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a great afternoon. We'll be right back. It's 15 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Back with more of the news of the day. What we could be doing in this country instead of stupid stuff. And your calls. Right after this. And welcome back. Bob in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Hey, Bob, what's on your mind today?
Well, hello, Tom. Long time. I hope you're getting along okay, staying well.
So far, knock wood. What's up,
Yeah.
Bob?
Oh, I just want to get it down to earth. In reflection of a previous caller mentioning regeneration of forest and so forth, I think we need to be talking about industrial hemp and what good that can do for the forest and the soil and the atmosphere, sequestering carbon, creating jobs, and so forth. Well, the marijuana
is
thing,
not industrial hemp now legal all across the United States, Bob?
Not really. No, it's a Schedule I drug. That's what cannabis is, according to the federal government.
And where's all this CBD coming from?
Well, it's just kind of private deals that, and I would remind Lori and others that any relationship with Donald Trump is going to be weird and strange. Any relationship. And corrupt. So, farmers are growing hemp successfully. You can look. It's in various publications. Canada, you can invest in hemp and marijuana. Now, if you try to invest in hemp and marijuana in the United States, you're going to have a little bit of difficulty. You'll have difficulty finding any broker to do that for you in the first place. Now, I live in a place where three rivers come together and go down into the Gulf of Mexico, so we can get barges up and down. Farmers ought to be real happy about hemp. But not too many farmers speak up about it, talk about it, discuss it out in the open. I never hear Mr. Wolf discuss it when he talks about economics. I never hear Lori Wallach discuss it when she discusses economics. I never hear Ralph Nader discuss it when he discusses economics. And if you read their books,
it being hemp.
We need hemp to regenerate the forest and the soil and the atmosphere so we can live like humans on the surface of the earth. That's it. That's all I want.
I don't think it's quite that magic a bullet, but I do agree with you, Bob, that it's crazy that...
I'm not saying it's magic. I'm not sensationalizing it. I'm saying it is work. Farming and gardening's work, but hemp is a big helper. And if we're not going to allow people to use it, then we can't really talk about freedom and democracy. You got to get it at the basic, fundamental levels of where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah. Okay, Bob. I'm not disagreeing with you. Thank you very much for the call. Gene in Myerstown, Pennsylvania. Hey, Gene, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I wonder if you have been thinking like I have, and I don't hear it anywhere on the news or talk shows about, do you think that this COVID-19 virus is going to convince more and more people about the inadequacy of our private health care system. These people are going to be coming out of these ICUs for 20, 30 days, and in about 4 weeks,
it's $1 million bill.
They're going to start coming, and those pages, it's going to be pages and pages and pages of charges. Most of these people don't even have insurance, I bet.
Yeah, I am with you. And Gene, I think that there's a growing consensus across the United States that health care is part of our national security. So, hopefully this will all lead to single-payer health care. We'll be back.
Our 1 hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3 hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program.
So it turns out back in November, the spy agencies in the United States were notifying the Trump administration that something's going on in China. Looks like another SARS outbreak. Maybe we should get ready for this. It was ignored. I've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for the supporters of our program that basically goes through the whole timeline, all the way from, actually going back to 2018 when Trump disbanded 3 different anti-pandemic agencies in the Department of Homeland Security, the National Security Council, and the executive branch. Just closed them down, fired the people. That was the end of that. How he ignored the intelligence in November, he ignored the intelligence in December, he ignored the epidemic now coming into the United States in January, he ignored it in February, just going the blow-by-blow timeline. And I think it's really worth having it all in one place, a good recap, a good summary of this that you can refer to and you can share with your friends. It's all over at thomhartmann.com. You can check it out. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Matt Robinson, writing for Alternet a little while ago, he's pointing out Germany has reinstituted their Kurzarbeit program. This is the short work program. It's where if a company lays you off, the federal government of Germany pays your salary. They do it through the company, but they pay your salary. The company can't make money on it. They can't use it for executive salaries. They can't use it for stock buybacks. They didn't make all the stupid mistakes. Well, these aren't actually mistakes that we made here in the United States. These are things that Mitch McConnell wrote in there to help out big corporations and fat cats who fund his campaigns. He's got a serious campaign challenger in Amy McGrath there in Kentucky, and she may well end up being the next senator from Kentucky. She is great. And McConnell is trying to get all the money he can from the usual sources. But anyhow, Matt Robinson also talks about how the UK is paying 80% of freelancers' income. You don't have to prove that you had a paycheck. You just have to show that you had income. Right? So if you're, that you put it in the bank, just show the bank record. Here you go. 80%. It's the UK. Japan, they're paying, they're actually encouraging people to do tourism within Japan because they've largely got the virus under control there, and they're actually giving people travel vouchers, and they're covering half the cost of domestic travel in Japan to try and encourage people to get back into the economy. Australia is trying to preserve 120,000 apprenticeship jobs because their economy has not collapsed or crashed. They're paying people $3,000 a month just to be an Australian. Switzerland is fast-tracking relief for small businesses. But here in the United States, it's all cronyism, huge corporations sucking up the money. And now the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, the Democrats in the House of Representatives, have been, for the last couple of weeks, working on a new piece of legislation. It'll be over $2 trillion. It'll be larger than the last CARES bill. It'll be called CARES 2. Most of its benefits are going to actual small businesses and actual people like you and me. And Mitch McConnell is saying, Not going to sign it, not going to go there unless you have something in there that says that for the rest of all time, henceforth now into eternity, you cannot, a worker or a customer cannot sue a corporation anymore if they're harmed by that corporation. So that's McConnell's line in the sand. Then Trump comes along, he says, I got a line in the sand too. We've got to disable, we've got to cripple Social Security. We got to cut the Social Security tax. Now, it's actually an insurance payment if you want to be technically correct about this. But it is called a tax and administered by the IRS. So you've got to cut that Social Security tax to cut the revenue going into Social Security so we can kneecap Social Security the same way back in 2006 we kneecapped the post office. And once you take, they've taken down, they're in the process of taking down the post office. Next, Social Security, the post office goes to FedEx and UPS, who are big donors to political campaigns. Social Security goes to Citibank and Wells Fargo and Bank of America and Chase, JP Morgan Chase, big donors to political campaigns. I mean, these guys know what they want. I got a note from one of our listeners who lives in Australia. She has called into the program in the past under the name of Katie, which is her name. And she's talking about how everyone in Australia has medical care. Everyone has access to testing and treatment at the hospitals. The hospitals have no shortage of staff, equipment, or PPE. Most of the 97 deaths that the entire country has had are related to cruise ships and nursing homes. The federal government has made available a generous support plan for laid-off workers. All the people in this situation receive 2 one-time payments of $750 while you wait for your status to be validated. Then you receive $3,000 a month. The fear and rage so prevalent in the U.S. has been avoided so far here in Australia. The contrast, she writes, is heartbreaking. Their prime minister is a conservative Pentecostal, but he's pushing containment and self-isolation on the right-wing media because the Australians get it, and because Rupert Murdoch lives in the United States now. She says this bipartisan approach has been inspirational to watch. She says, Louise, you make a good barber, a talent I have acquired, and I want your listeners to know what my experience has been and to be able to say, I have a friend in Australia, and here's her experience living in a country that spends way more on supporting its citizens than it does on growing billionaires. Brilliant, Katie. Absolutely brilliant. And by the way, in Australia, if you show up in the country, you have to be quarantined for 14 days. They put you up in a plush hotel or an island accommodation. Yeah, not too shabby. So, meanwhile, our federal jails are intentionally destroying medical records. This is amazing. The Intercept is reporting on this. Nick Pinto over at The Intercept writing about this. They're actually trying to hide the records of who's dying from coronavirus, just like DeSantis is in Florida.
To the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Republican policies and Trump's incompetence are killing Americans. 80,000 now, and they're trying to hide it from you.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club. We Earthlings need to build a fundamental change of consciousness into ourselves and in every part of our national and global society in order to achieve the economic and political changes necessary to prevent the destruction of the life support system of Earth, in order to end global and domestic poverty and wealth inequality, to defeat racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of xenophobia, to protect human rights, to achieve social, economic, and environmental justice, and to achieve lasting global peace. This new consciousness is possible and can emerge through embracing revolutionary love, the struggle for a caring society, and a new bottom line in all our economic, political, legal, educational, and cultural institutions. This manifesto is written to show you how this can happen and how you can help make it possible. Liberal and progressive movements need to move beyond a focus on economic entitlements and political rights to embrace a new discourse of love, kindness, generosity, and awe. These are not some new agey smile and be nice formula or let's get into self-transformation before we change society kind of thinking. I'm calling for both American and global societies to embrace a new bottom line so that every economic, political, societal, and cultural institution is considered efficient, rational, and or productive, not according to the old bottom line of how much these institutions maximize money, power, or ego, but rather how much they maximize love and generosity, kindness and forgiveness, ethical and environmentally sustainable behavior, social and economic justice. This new bottom line seeks to enhance our capacity to transcend a narrow utilitarian or instrumental way of viewing human beings and nature, so that we respond to other people as embodiments of the sacred, instead of thinking of them primarily in terms of how much they can serve our interests. And also so that we can respond to nature not solely as a resource for human needs, but rather through awe, wonder, and radical amazement at the beauty and grandeur of this universe. I call this new consciousness revolutionary love, and its goal is to create the caring society, caring for each other and caring for the earth. The vehicle to create this new consciousness we will call the Love and Justice Movement, and eventually the Love and Justice Party. The revolutionary possibility of love is the kind of love that breaks through those distortions of consciousness that make it difficult to implement a national environmental policy or to end the many forms of oppression that permeate our world. To really embrace revolutionary love requires us to develop a strategy way beyond anything currently being given serious attention in the media, the political parties, and even many of the social change movements. And it requires us to move beyond what seems realistic in terms of the contemporary frame of discourse. Yet there is no alternative if we're to solve the environmental crisis and prevent our society in the coming decades from moving further and further into reactionary nationalism and repression of our own humanity. We need a global mobilization of billions of people to solve the problem, and this manifesto outlines the first steps to making possible such a mobilization. To understand the urgency, let's consider our current environmental crisis. In 1992, thousands of scientists issued a collective statement warning of the impending dangers to the life support system of planet Earth. 25 years later, in December 2017, 15,364 scientists from 184 countries signed a new statement that reads, in part, "Since 1992, with the exception of stabilizing the stratospheric ozone layer, humanity has failed to make sufficient progress in generally solving these unforeseen environmental changes, and alarmingly, most of them are getting far worse. Especially troubling is the current trajectory of potentially catastrophic climate change due to rising greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels and agricultural production, particularly from farming ruminants for meat consumption. Moreover, we have unleashed a mass extinction event, the sixth in roughly 540 million years, wherein many current life forms could be annihilated or at least committed to extinction by the end of this century. Humanity is now being given a second notice. We are jeopardizing our future by not reining in our intense but geologically and demographically uneven material consumption, and by not perceiving continued rapid population growth as a planetary driver behind many ecological and even societal threats. By failing to adequately limit population growth, reassess the role of an economy rooted in growth, reduce greenhouse gases, incentivize renewable energy, protect habitat, restore ecosystems, curb pollution, halt defaunation, and constrain invasive alien species, humanity is not taking the urgent steps needed to safeguard our imperiled biosphere." End of quote from the scientists. And in October, well, it continues. The book is Revolutionary Love by Rabbi Michael Lerner. Purpose in making the world a safer place for women and girls. Pat Mitchell, Becoming a Dangerous Woman.
Coming up on the Science Revolution this week, entomologist Professor Gard W. Otis is here on the murder hornets. They invade hives and decapitate the bees inside in just a matter of hours, and scientists worry about them gaining a foothold in North America. Beyond nuclears, Kevin Camps drops by on the announcement of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission that it's proceeding illegally with licensing a proposed high-level radioactive waste dump in New Mexico. Plus, author Stephen Hassan on the cult of Trump. Find the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, picking up your phone calls here. John in Seattle. Hey, John, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I've been reading Piketty's latest book, Capital and Ideology, in which he has extended his understanding of capitalism to include most of the last 500 years. He identifies 3 eras. In each era, the wealthy have taken a bigger share of the pie, ending in first era, the sort of the medieval era, ending about 1790. The second era up to World War I, ending in 1914, and in the present. And there's a huge amount in this book. It's just astonishing, his work. But the specific insight I get out of the first half of the book is that it doesn't matter what the rules are. The rich will subvert the system and take more each time. Maybe today the rule is the Koch brothers lying about the way they use 401k organizations, as one learns from Jane Mayer's Dark Money book. But the Piketty looking at all of this, and I was specifically triggered to call you today because of your mention of Germany. He speaks of the Germany, Austria, and the Nordic countries as having created a taxation system and a management system that has prevented the excesses of Reaganism and Thatcherism that we have been suffering under.
Through
anyway,
presumably higher income taxes, estate taxes, and 50% of the board being made up of workers? Is that what you're talking about?
Bingo. In fact, the second half of the book I'm looking... Yep, the second half of the book I'm looking forward to is he actually has some countervailing pressures that we could use against the fact that Exxon owns 5 trillion barrels that we don't want them to take out of the ground, and we can't afford to pay them for it. In 1804, when Haiti became independent, they adopted a debt to pay for the loss of slaves by French plantation owners that was 300% of their income, annual product. It took them 150 years to pay for. We are greatly at risk in an ownership-only society. We need something like temporary ownership or an acceptance of risk on the part of those who make investments that they might actually not come into fruition. And Piketty, despite being, such an astonishingly great writer and informative, has actually got some thoughts about how we might rebalance things. It is both synoptic, and I told the gal who answered the phone that I wanted to do a book report, but what I'm really wanting to share with you is this fact that the rich are good at subverting the rules. It doesn't matter what the rules are. In the case of the Koch brothers, think about their network of 401c3 foundations that are ostensibly not doing political activity, that nakedly do political activity, and nobody's suing them. Nobody's getting them to pay taxes. We're losing our republic, as you pointed out.
I'm with you. John, I'll have to check that out. I tried to read Capital, his last book. It was just too dense. I mean, I wish there had been a Cliff Notes version, or, because my schedule is so nuts. I mean, I spend the mornings doing this show and doing prep for it, and the late evenings, and then my afternoons I'm writing my own books, and so it's hard to find time to read a 500-page book. But Piketty is a brilliant writer, and so.
And the first book was much drier. Out of that, I got like 3 points about how economics operates in some data series. Right. But what happened was, apparently, it triggered the collection of data by hundreds of folks around the planet. And so this second book, he's got a broader survey. He's taken a longer view, looking at the era of clergy, nobility, and labor, which he calls trifunctional, the era of proprietarianism when the franchise was extended during the 19th century, and it looks like we might get a handle on wealth, and then the current era of ownership. It's actually way more informative. I learned what the opium wars are, for example, which I had not known previously.
Okay.
And
I will have to check it out. John, I have to move along, but thank you.
You bet.
Yeah,
nice to
thank
chat.
you.
Bye.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the information. I really do. And I look forward to the book. In fact, I'm going to order it this afternoon. Paul in St. Louis. Hey, Paul, what's up?
Hey, Tom. You've been talking about excessive greed today, and I found a word that doesn't get mentioned much, but it's actually the definition of greed is pleonexia, and it's from an ancient Greek word. And I Googled your dictionary, and that's the name of the site, your dictionary, and the second part of the definition is a psychiatric disorder characterized by greediness and excessive desire for acquisition of wealth and objects. So, that is
pleonexia?
Pleonexia, Pleonexia.
Pleo is the root. And you said that's Greek. What does it mean? Do you know?
It just says here it's a noun, and it says the first part of the definition is excessive or insatiable greed, avarice, covetous, the desire to have more, a greedy desire for certain goods.
Wow. Pleonexia is the root of all evil. I love it. We could rewrite 1 Timothy. Paul, thank you for the call. That's fascinating. I'll have to check that out. I appreciate it. Wynn in Salon, Maine. How do you say it, Wynn? I know you've called before. I can't remember the town.
Yeah, you keep asking me every time I call how to say that. We say it up here, Solon. Kind of simple,
okay.
But okay.
So what's up?
You are well forgiven. Well, I originally called to talk about the mortality rate and how that has continued to increase. I've been tracking it. I'm a scientist and a mathematician, and I've been tracking the mortality rate of this so-called crisis since February. And it started out at 0.9% mortality rate, and it's steadily increased, even through, here we are going to open up, right? It's now over 6%. Okay? And it went over 6% 2-3 days ago. Now, these are on the figures that are reported, of course. And that's my main gripe. We do not have data. You asked the question, they're hiding. You said, that the Trump administration is hiding stuff from us. Yeah, they are. We don't have data. I can't get good data. I can't get racial types. I can't get ages. I can't, because I do derivations on the data. Like
so hang on just a second. We have 1.3 million diagnosed cases in the United States, and we have 81,000 deaths. You're saying that's 6%. I can't do the math that fast in my head, but that sounds about right.
As of today, it's 6.06, something like that, between 6.06 and 6.1% mortality rate. And it's increased every day until we're getting into the rate of the rate which is a derivation.
So if you look at Germany, they're at 172,000 with 7,000 deaths. That would be closer to 5%, wouldn't it? 4.5% if I'm doing my back of the envelope math fast enough.
Okay, give me those numbers again really quick. I can do it in seconds. It's what?
172,000 cases, 7,600 deaths.
7,600 deaths. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, 172,000.
Yeah.
Okay. That is 0.04. Unless I punched in the wrong one.
So that's roughly 4%.
4%, yeah. 4%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas we're running around 6%. And you wonder how much of that is an artifact of our healthcare system, or just the fact that we've got 40% of the American population is living in poverty. And, the diseases of poverty make you more vulnerable to dying from COVID if you get it.
Correct. And
not a problem that they have in Germany.
But then there's the rate of the rate. This is increasing. And strangely enough, 2 weeks ago, we started talking about opening up. All of a sudden, what we have is a decrease in the rate of the rate. And so I think somebody's hiding something. It just doesn't happen like that.
Yeah. Well, we know Ron DeSantis is hiding numbers in Florida. Greg Abbott is probably hiding them in Texas. You've got, the meatpacking plants. I believe it was Nebraska, might have been Iowa. We're told you don't have to report these. Don't worry. It's proprietary corporate information. When there's something going on here, as you dig into this and dig a little deeper and find out what's going on, give me a shout back next week. Let's keep us all up to date on this. Stick around. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
45 minutes past the hour. It's the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be back with more of your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Jamie in Nacogdoches, Texas. Hey, Jamie, what's up?
Hey, Tom. What do you know about the test swabs and how accurate they are? In our area, I know of 4 people who have been tested positive, but yet they weren't sick. So is it like TB that you can be a carrier, but you don't have TB? What's the deal?
Yeah, it appears that about 40%. There are some people who are saying it's as low as 30%. There are others saying it's as high as 60%. But the numbers that I'm seeing quoted most commonly are somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of people who become infected with the virus, walking around for a couple of weeks, shedding the virus, spraying it on other people, literally never have any symptoms. Or if they have symptoms, those symptoms are so minor that they just think, it's a passing headache or a light cold or something like that. So there's a substantial number of people who are going to test positive without symptoms. They're called asymptomatic carriers.
Well, I enjoy your program so much.
Well, thank you, Jane.
Especially when you read and it breaks the flowers and the bees. Thanks, Tom. Bye-bye.
Great. Well, thank you. And a tip of the hat to Nate for putting those things together. Jamie, thank you. Jessica in Riverside, Illinois, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Jessica, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I do think that the death rate is a lot higher than 6% when you think of Florida not telling any of their deaths. And then also, I was happy you brought up the pharmaceuticals that are made in India and in China. Our country should have Puerto Rico make the pharmaceuticals here for people's safety so that there's no shortage. That's important.
Well, and before Puerto Rico, we used to make them in New Jersey.
Yeah, crazy. And one reason I called, too, the Blue Angels are flying over our hospitals, the University of Chicago Hospital, where my neighbor works with COVID-19 patients. He's an anesthesiologist there. And don't get me wrong, the Blue Angels are amazing pilots. But my neighbor has to work. He has to wear his PPE 24 hours straight because they have a shortage of the PPE there. They have to stretch it. And so nobody is a fan of spending 60,000 plus on these planes. The doctors and nurses, nobody's a fan of the wastefulness at this time.
Yeah. It's an exhibition of our national values, Jessica. We are still exalting our military and militarism above, frankly, our doctors and nurses and orderlies and janitors and all the people who work in hospitals who are literally putting their lives on the line every single day. And not just their lives, the lives of their family members, their friends, their acquaintances.
What makes me so sad is my neighbor. He has 2 little kids. He's so caring. I was walking with this little girl because she wanted to pet our.
Finish your sentence, Jessica.
I'm sorry. She wanted to pet the cat. He stood up because he was afraid I would come too close to him. He put his hand up to say stop, and I wasn't going to go close to him, but he was worried about me because he around the COVID-19.
These are people who really care. Jessica, thanks for sharing that story. Did you know that Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president in 1980 and George Herbert Walker Bush was in on it and he avoided being prosecuted for this in 1992 with a little help from Bill Barr? It's on page 116 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. James in Seattle. Hey, James, what's up?
Well, I just wanted to disagree with you a bit that this corporate welfare, which we should brand corporate socialism, it's the cause of. There's a one-to-one relationship between the 400 billionaire families and the super poor in this country, and that's where the damage to the middle class has not been, hasn't been nice, but for them, these people have both of their hands in the front and back pockets of the poor and fees and co-pays and whatever, and that's why they don't want a basic income for them, because if you provide them from a basic income yearly, they can't exist. You might have a few billionaires, but you would not have the 400 billionaires. They couldn't exist, because that's where they get those pennies add up to with the millions of people that are they're in poverty in this country. You get rid of the poor, you get rid of them too, and they know that.
Yeah. And if you look at the countries where basically they don't have poverty, countries in Northern Europe, for example, what you find is that they do have some very rich people, but it's not the kind of obscene riches that you have here in the United States. I'm not sure what you're disagreeing with me about, James, but I'll take what you got. Vicki in Gilmanton, Wisconsin. Hey, Vicki, what's up?
Hi, I remember back in the day, a couple of years ago, when I read Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb and his talk about. Oh, yeah, that was a couple of years ago. Anyway, why is our country so hell-bent on not allowing any other countries that we, help to even talk about population control?
Because of Catholicism in large part, the Catholic ban on birth control, which really just started a few hundred years ago, and on abortion. That Catholic ban was adopted by basically racists. Hitler, for example, adopted that because he wanted the good white German women to produce more good white German babies. And you saw the same thing with Ceausescu in Romania, I believe it was, his country. You see the same thing, right now with Orban in Hungary, encouraging, population growth among white people in the country. And so, to a large extent, the anti-birth control movement and the anti-abortion movement are joined at the hip in many ways and in many places with the "we want more white people and fewer people of color" movement, which includes the whole Stephen Miller thing about, in the 1920s, I think it was 1924, the United States passed its first racially based, well, actually it was the second. The first one was in 1883, I believe. It was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred the importation of laborers from China. And then in the 1920s, I think it was 24, we passed a law that basically only allowed immigration from European countries, from white countries, and essentially banned immigration from countries where there were a lot of people of color. That was changed in the 60s. It was somewhere between 64 and 67. Lyndon Johnson, I believe, might have been Kennedy, but I'm pretty sure it was LBJ, changed that law and created a lottery system for countries, with people of color, not just Africa, but around the world. And as a result, from the 60s until just this last 2 or 3 years, you had, of the 1 million immigrants who came to the United States, prior to the 60s, they were almost all white people. After the 60s, they were about half people of color and half white people, and in some cases, more people of color, because the world population is mostly people of color. More people of color were coming into the United States than white people. And Donald Trump and Stephen Miller set out to change that. And so that whole movement about making America white again, which is really the subtext to make America great again, has combined with the anti-birth control and anti-abortion movement, that originally came out of Catholicism, which was in part to increase the number of Catholics. I mean, you could take this back to the Middle Ages in some ways, back to the days when whichever tribe or whichever group had the largest population, the most young men in their armies, they won the wars. And so the Catholics were like, we're going to outpopulate the Protestants. And, here we are. And we need to have, a reasonable conversation about population. And we need to also have a conversation about the relationship between efforts to stifle birth control and abortion and efforts to stifle the rights of women, because it's all the same stuff. I got to run. Lori in Portland. Lori, you got the last minute. What's up?
I was just calling about the random testing in Corvallis, Oregon. They've been doing it for 3 weeks. They're on their 4th week next week, and they've been finding, just going to people's homes and doing a random test, that about every 2 out of 1,000 are coming up positive. And these are people that don't know, so that's to say what you were talking on earlier, is people are walking around not knowing it. And one of the interesting things is that they are breaking it down by zip code. And so you get to see where in the zip code how many cases are basically in your neighborhood, which I think is really good, because I think it brings it home to people that, wow, I have my neighbors.
Where is that published, Lori? I'd love to look it up.
It is in the Corvallis Gazette Times.
Corvallis Gazette Times.
It's really Corvallis Gazette Times, yeah.
I'll check it out.
And they're trying to get funding to do the antibody test next.
That would be great. And find out how many people have had it and doesn't even realize it. Lori, thank you. Thanks for the heads up on that. I'll check it out. This is a great experiment that is being funded right here in Oregon by the governor's office, I believe. I saw a press release from Kate Brown about this a week or so ago. Anyhow, thanks so much for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us. And it also requires an informed electorate. So tell people how they can find progressive media. Please tag your it. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a wonderful afternoon. Be good to yourself and others.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
Here's how I feel about the value of our nation's postal service. The humble post office is a community fixture, a civic inheritance, a rural lifeline, and one of the last vestiges of a shared civic culture in America. Tolerate it, treasure it, and don't let the vicissitudes of global capitalism, contempt for government, or a viral outbreak take it away. Those are my sentiments, but not my words. They're from the American Conservative magazine, calling on people of all political persuasions to save this vital public institution. The men and women of the Postal Service have been steadfast in their duties, especially in times of national emergencies, literally delivering for the American people. In today's terrible pandemic, these workers have kept communication and commerce flowing. No matter who you are, how rich or poor, living in teeming inner cities or isolated rural reaches, postal employees are on the job, so you and I can get our mail, medicines, food, household necessities, election ballots, and other basics brought right to our doors. A stamp is cheap, yet the wear, tear, and costs for the postal workforce can be high. For example, about 1,200 of them have been infected by COVID-19, and at least 44 have died. Yet, the entire public system is now under direct attack by a man-made pestilence called Trumpista vitriolitis that's emanating from the White House. By controlling a $10 billion line of credit that the post office must have to get through the current coronavirus depression, Trump is demanding cuts in the wages, benefits, and rights of our stalwart postal workers, plus authority over hiring top postal officials and the right to raise postal rates. This is Jim Hightower saying, to help stop Trump's power play to become America's postal potentate and privatizer-in-chief, go to the American Postal Workers Union at usmailnotforsale.org.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Shatter the Nations, ISIS and the War for the Caliphate by Mike Giglio. This is from the prologue. Dateline, Mosul, Iraq, February 2017. Abdul Wahab swore it was a true story. His eyes were reflected in the rearview mirror as he sped his pickup through battle-beaten country. To the left, the setting sun cast a Polaroid haze across brown fields and squat stone farmhouses. To the right was a ridge of mountains. Ahead was a flat road and a darkening sky. There was a soldier, a big soldier named Will. That's how Abdul Wahab put it. He pronounced the name Wool. Wool, Wool. He said it a couple more times, like he hadn't said it in a while. He slowed the truck to roll through the final checkpoint manned by the Kurdish militia, whose green and red flags snapped in a bitter wind. A soldier in a scarf manned a machine gun on the barricade that marked the boundary. From there, the road led 60 miles through territory controlled by the Iraqi military to the edge of Mosul and the last bastions of the ISIS caliphate. Will was one of the American Special Forces sent to Iraq more than a decade earlier to kill insurgents. The nights of the Iraq War had been filled with U.S. commando raids, and the Americans had created Abdul Wahab's elite battalion to do the raids with them, an Iraqi version of the Delta Force, or SEAL Team 6. The battalion had an English name, the Iraqi Counterterrorism Force, and was known by its initials, ICTF, which the men sewed onto their uniforms and painted on their Humvees. The Iraqis admired their American mentors. They picked up the Special Forces ethos, wore baseball caps and sunglasses, used words like the F word and bro and dude. But Will was different, Abdul Wahab said. He would lose control. Abdul Wahab kept his foot on the gas pedal as he raced through a Christian town that seemed to be empty. ISIS had destroyed some of the houses, and the ones still standing were dark. Not a soul was visible except a trio of Iraqi soldiers who sat on a leather couch on the roadside. The photographer, Warzar Jaf, was in the passenger seat. I was in the back. Abdul Wahab's M16 was by my feet. An ICTF veteran in his 40s who had given up fighting, Abdul Wahab had been ferrying Jaf and me to and from Mosul for months. He was stocky and gruff and expert at passing through the myriad checkpoints that led to the front lines, always knowing what to say or whom to call or when to gift his sunglasses to an admiring militiaman. He was an ideal wheelman for navigating the strange tapestry of the alliance, with all its varied forces flying their banners around the city like armies in a medieval siege. His commanders used him for special transport of weapons and supplies, and officers who wanted to escape for a night to the hotels of Erbil, the Kurdish capital and nearest outpost of modernity, a place where they could find a decent dinner and booze, or visit a mall or swim in a pool, and grasp at a moment of normalcy on the edge of the world's most brutal war zone. As grumpy as Sean, he was forever making the 45-mile journey between the two valley cities, and when Jaf and I had no other way to get to the war, we went with him. A folk song about an old battle was playing on the radio. You made your tribe proud of you. I can hear them scream. Abdul Wahab was still talking about will. First, he began shooting animals.